The walking stick struck frozen asphalt in steady rhythm, each tap echoing across the empty mountain road like a heartbeat counting down the moments before everything changed. Eleanor Whitmore had walked this route every morning for 28 years, through summers that painted the valley gold and winters that carved the landscape into brutal beauty. At 78, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that strength wasn't about speed, it was about refusing to stop. The air bit deep this morning, sharp enough to make her lungs ache with each breath. 5:30 meant darkness still clung to the pine forests, though the eastern sky had begun its slow surrender to dawn. She adjusted her wool scarf, the one Harold had given her on their 50th anniversary, just months before the cancer took him. 2 years now. Some mornings she still turned to tell him something interesting, only to find empty air where his presence used to be. Her breath formed small clouds that dissolved into the mountain silence. This was her time when the world belonged to her alone, and the grief that lived in her chest could expand without witnesses. People in town thought she was stubborn for staying in the cabin, foolish for these pre-dawn walks, reckless for living alone at her age. They didn't understand that loneliness and solitude were different countries entirely. Eleanor Whitmore knew things about herself that 78 years of living had taught her. She knew she could suture a torn artery with fishing line if necessary, having done exactly that during 2 years at a field hospital in Korea. She knew she could walk 6 miles in sub-zero weather because pain was just information the body provided. She knew that fear was a choice, and she had stopped choosing it sometime around her 30th birthday. The walking stick Harold had carved felt solid in her weathered hands, its surface worn smooth by countless journeys. He'd made it during the winter. His arthritis finally claimed his woodworking, each groove and curve shaped with the patient love that had defined their marriage. She could feel him in the grain of the wood, in the perfect balance that made each step a little easier. Movement caught her attention as she rounded the bend near Devil's Curve. At first, her aging eyes registered only dark shapes against darker road, but as she moved closer, the shapes resolved into something that made her stop completely. 2 motorcycles lay twisted beside the guardrail, chrome catching the weak dawn light like broken teeth. Black skid marks carved violent patterns across the ice-slicked asphalt, telling a story of physics and panic and speed meeting immovable reality. The smell hit her next, gasoline mixing with something organic and wrong, the scent of disaster. 2 men lay motionless in positions where momentum had thrown them. Even from 30 feet away, Eleanor could see the unnatural stillness of bodies that had stopped responding to the basic commands of survival. Her nurse's training kicked in before thought could interfere, categorizing what she saw with clinical detachment that had served her through worse sights than this. The larger man wore a leather jacket covered in patches. Even unconscious and broken, he projected menace. His massive frame sprawled like a fallen monument to violence. The skull and wings emblem spread across his back identified him as clearly as a fingerprint. Hell's Angels. The smaller patches told stories of hierarchy and territory, of brotherhood earned through blood and loyalty tested in ways decent people never imagined. His companion was younger, leaner, dressed in similar armor of leather and defiance. Both men had the blue-tinged skin that spoke of hypothermia advancing toward the irreversible. Their breathing was shallow, irregular, the kind of respiratory pattern that preceded organ failure and death. Eleanor approached with her walking stick, providing balance on the treacherous ice. Somewhere in the back of her mind, fear tried to assert itself, suggesting she turn around and walk away. Let someone else handle dangerous men with dangerous reputations. She acknowledged the fear the way you acknowledge weather, noting its presence without letting it dictate action. What she saw were 2 human beings dying. Everything else was detail. The Korean War had taught her that enemy soldiers bled red just like friendly forces, that screaming sounded the same in every language, that death didn't care about politics or affiliation. She had held the hands of North Korean boys who cried for their mothers while she tried to stop their intestines from spilling onto mud floors. She had performed field surgery on men who had been trying to kill her comrades hours earlier. Wounded was wounded. Need was need. She knelt beside the larger man, her joints protesting the movement, but obeying anyway. Her fingers found his carotid artery, pressing until she detected the faint thready pulse that indicated his heart was still trying to do its job, despite everything working against it. His skin felt like ice beneath her touch, his core temperature dangerously low. Primary survey first the training whispered from 50 years ago, airway breathing circulation. She cleared his airway manually, checking for obstructions, adjusting his position to maximize oxygen flow. His chest rose and fell with painful irregularity, each breath a small victory against the cold that was stealing his life. The younger man showed no visible respiratory effort. Eleanor pressed her fingers against his neck, searching for signs of life, and nearly gave up before detecting the ghost of a pulse so weak she questioned whether she'd imagined it. His hypothermia was more advanced, his body's core temperature having dropped past the point where shivering provided warmth. Without immediate intervention, he would be dead within the hour. The larger man's eyes opened suddenly, confusion and alarm flooding features that were probably intimidating when consciousness allowed them to express intention. He tried to move his body, responding sluggishly to commands from a brain that was struggling to process basic information. "Don't move." Eleanor's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. "You have severe hypothermia and possible internal injuries. Sudden movement could kill you." The man's gaze focused on her face with visible effort, traveling from her weathered features to her walking stick to the empty road beyond, trying to make sense of how an elderly woman had materialized in his dying moments. His lips moved soundlessly, frost forming on the beard that covered half his face. "My friend." The words emerged as barely audible whisper. "Danny, is he?" Eleanor was already moving to check the younger man again, her hands working with practiced efficiency despite the cold that was making her own fingers stiff. "He's alive but critical. You both need immediate warming and medical attention." She returned to kneel beside the larger man, studying his face now that consciousness had returned to it. Beneath the intimidating exterior, she could see fear, genuine concern for his companion that spoke to humanity she suspected most people never bothered to look for. "Can you tell me your name?" Her tone was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who needed information to provide care. Tank, his teeth chattered between words, his body's desperate attempt to generate warmth through involuntary muscle contractions. "Marcus Tank Brennan, that's Danny Merrick. We crashed coming down from Billings. Ice caught the back wheel." Eleanor nodded, already formulating a plan that would require physical effort beyond what most 78-year-olds could provide. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away in good weather, and ambulances wouldn't reach this remote stretch of road in time to matter. She could treat hypothermia in her cabin using techniques learned in Korea when supplies were limited and improvisation meant survival. "Tank, I need you to listen carefully." She leaned close so he could hear her, clearly despite his deteriorating condition. "I live nearby. I'm going to get equipment to transport you both. Don't try to move and don't fall asleep. Keep talking to Danny even if he doesn't respond. Can you do that?" Tank's eyes showed surprise at her calm competence, at the complete absence of fear or hesitation in her approach to men who should terrify her. He managed a slight nod, the effort visible in how it drained what little color remained in his face. Eleanor stood testing her balance on the icy road before beginning the walk back to her cabin. 15 minutes there and back, maybe 20 with the equipment she'd need. Tank and Danny would have to survive that long on their own, their bodies fighting a battle against cold that they were losing with each passing minute. The walk home felt endless despite her practiced pace. Her mind cataloged supplies even as her legs carried her up the mountain road. Harold's old toboggan was stored in the shed designed for hauling firewood, but sturdy enough for human cargo. Every blanket in the house would be needed, plus the full medical kit she maintained. Despite retirement, the one that held supplies most people would consider obsolete, but that she knew could mean the difference between life and death. The cabin came into view as dawn finally broke across the valley, turning the log walls golden in the early light. Harold had built this place with his own hands, cutting each timber and fitting every joint with the precision that had made him the most sought-after carpenter in 3 counties. Even now, 2 years after his passing, she could see his craftsmanship in every detail, his love in every carefully chosen board. Inside, she moved with practiced efficiency, gathering everything she would need for an operation that would test limits she hadn't approached in decades. Blankets came off the bed, the couch, the closet where she stored extras for winter. Hot water bottles were filled from the kettle she kept permanently on the wood stove. The medical kit emerged from the bathroom cabinet, its worn canvas exterior hiding capabilities that 70 years of nursing experience had taught her to maintain. The toboggan Harold had built felt heavier than she remembered, but she dragged it out of the shed anyway, refusing to acknowledge the strain and muscles that had grown older without her permission. She loaded it with supplies, creating a mobile rescue unit that would have to be enough. By the time she returned to the crash site, Tank had deteriorated visibly. His speech was more slurred, his movements uncoordinated, his body losing the battle against cold despite his efforts to stay conscious. Danny remained completely unresponsive, his breathing so shallow Eleanor had to watch carefully to confirm his chest was still moving. Tank tried to help as Eleanor began the careful process of moving Danny onto the toboggan, showing surprising gentleness despite his own critical condition. His massive hands supported Danny's head, with the kind of care that spoke to deep brotherhood, to bonds forged through shared danger and mutual protection. "Lady, you don't know what you're getting into." Tank's words came in gasps between chattering teeth. "People like us, we're nothing but trouble. Everyone knows it." Eleanor met his eyes directly, seeing past the intimidating exterior to the frightened man underneath who was watching his friend die and couldn't stop it. "Right now, you're just two people who need help. That's all that matters." She secured Danny carefully on the toboggan, wrapping him in layers of blankets that would begin the slow process of raising his core temperature. Tank tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support his weight, forcing him to accept Eleanor's assistance in getting positioned on the toboggan beside Danny. The journey to Eleanor's cabin became a test of will over circumstance. The toboggan, built for hauling split oak and maple, now carried 400 pounds of unconscious bikers wrapped in every blanket Eleanor owned. Her walking stick provided leverage as she pulled her breath, coming hard, her muscles screaming protest she refused to acknowledge. Tank drifted in and out of consciousness during the slow procession up the mountain road. When aware, he mumbled apologies and warnings about the danger Eleanor was inviting into her life. When unconscious, his breathing became dangerously shallow, forcing Eleanor to stop repeatedly to check his pulse and adjust his position to prevent shock. The cabin's warmth hit like a physical force when Eleanor finally got both men inside. She'd left the wood stove burning hot, and the small space had become almost tropical compared to the sub-zero temperature outside. The transformation of her living room into a field hospital took minutes muscle memory from Korea, directing her hands with the same confidence she'd brought to much worse situations. The wood stove was stoked to maximum heat, filling the room with radiating warmth that would begin the critical process of raising their core temperatures. Blankets were rotated through the oven, heated and replaced in constant cycle to maintain steady warming without shocking their systems. Hot water bottles were positioned strategically around torsos, the safest way to rewarm organs that had nearly shut down. Eleanor's military medical kit revealed itself as she worked the canvas bag unfolding to show supplies that looked ancient but remained effective. Morphine ampules from 1952 still sealed and potent, suture materials and antiseptic that had been considered advanced when Eisenhower was president, sterile packages that had traveled with her from Korea to civilian life, maintained faithfully for emergencies she had hoped would never come. She cut away Tank's leather jacket, carefully noting the patches as she worked. The 1% indicated outlaw status, a proud claim to existing outside acceptable society. MC designated motorcycle club affiliation. Other patches referenced military service territories, ranks within a hierarchy most outsiders never understood. As she removed layers of wet leather and denim, older scars became visible, telling stories of a lifetime lived violently. But removing the intimidating exterior revealed unexpected vulnerability. Tank's arms bore track marks from old drug use, now faded but still visible, evidence of demons he'd fought in ways that left permanent records. A tattoo across his chest read Semper Fi in Gothic letters, surrounded by Marine Corps insignia that indicated military service. Another tattoo, newer and more carefully executed, showed a child's name and birth date. Cora, 2016. She moved to Danny next, working with the same systematic efficiency. His tattoos were different, more artistic and less aggressive than Tank's battle-worn collection. A detailed dragon wound around his left arm, its scales rendered with precision that spoke of expensive work and genuine artistry. On his back, Eleanor discovered a memorial piece. Sarah, 1987 to 2010. Angel wings and roses. His hands showed calluses consistent with manual labor, rather than the scarred knuckles of a frequent fighter. As Eleanor monitored their vital signs, checking pulses and respiratory patterns every few minutes, she noticed something that made her stop completely. Tank's chest bore another tattoo she hadn't initially processed, partially obscured by the blankets she'd wrapped around him. It was a military unit designation. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Korea, 1952. Eleanor's breath caught as recognition struck like lightning. Harold's unit, the Marines who had rescued his position when Chinese forces overran their defensive line. Harold had told that story 100 times over 50 years of marriage, about the young Marines who had appeared out of nowhere, fighting through overwhelming enemy fire to evacuate wounded soldiers who would have died without that intervention. She pulled the blanket back further, studying the tattoo with hands that had started trembling for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The dates matched. The location matched. Tank couldn't be old enough to have served in Korea, but someone in his family obviously had someone whose service meant enough to commemorate permanently. Tank's eyes opened as Eleanor stared at his chest, her expression showing emotions she couldn't quite control. His gaze followed hers to the tattoo, confusion giving way to understanding as he recognized what she was seeing. My grandfather. His voice was stronger now, the warming process beginning to restore basic function. Marcus Brennan Sr. He pulled a lot of guys out of bad situations in Korea. Saved my life before I was even born by surviving long enough to have kids. Eleanor sat back, her mind reeling from the impossible coincidence that had brought this particular man to her road on this particular morning. Harold had searched for years after the war, trying to find the Marines who had saved him, wanting to thank them properly for the life they'd given back to him. He died never knowing their names, never able to complete that circle of gratitude that had mattered so much to him. And now, 50 years later, the grandson of one of those Marines lay in her living room, saved by the wife of the man his grandfather had rescued. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of poetic symmetry that transcended reasonable probability. Your grandfather saved my husband's life. Eleanor's voice carried wonder and grief in equal measure. Harold searched for him for decades. Wanted to say thank you. Wanted him to know that the life he saved was a good one, full of love and purpose. Tank stared at her, his eyes showing disbelief, warring with the undeniable evidence of matching histories. The mathematical improbability of this moment hung between them like visible proof of something larger than chance at work. The moment was interrupted by Danny's sudden gasp, his body convulsing as his core temperature reached the point where his brain could reassert control over basic functions. Eleanor moved immediately to his side, her hands steady as she checked his vitals and adjusted his position to prevent shock from the rapid warming. Danny's eyes opened, immediately alert in the way of people accustomed to waking in dangerous situations. His gaze swept the unfamiliar room with practiced wariness before fixing on Eleanor's face with growing alarm. Easy! Tank's voice cut through Danny's rising panic. We're safe, brother. This lady saved our lives. Danny struggled to sit up, his movements still unsteady from hypothermia recovery. His eyes never left Eleanor's face as he tried to reconcile her grandmotherly appearance with the medical competence visible in how she'd arranged the room, positioned the warming equipment, monitored their recovery. Where are we? His voice came rough, but gaining strength with each word. What happened to the bikes? Tank explained the crash and rescue, while Eleanor brought water and warm broth, the safest way to begin internal rewarming, without shocking systems that were still fragile. Danny listened with growing amazement, his expression shifting from suspicion to genuine bewilderment. You dragged us both up here by yourself. Danny's tone suggested he was questioning whether hypothermia had damaged his perception of reality. Lady weigh 160 and Tank's pushing 250. That's 400 pounds of dead weight. Harold's toboggan is very well constructed, Eleanor replied matter-of-factly, and necessity provides its own strength. Danny shook his head, slowly wincing as the movement reminded him of injuries he'd sustained in the crash. Road rash covered his right side, the kind of damage that came from sliding across frozen asphalt at speed. Eleanor had cleaned and dressed the wounds while he was unconscious, her field hospital training serving her well, even after 5 decades of civilian life. Nobody does stuff like this. Danny's voice carried conviction born from life experience. Nobody helps people like us without wanting something in return. Eleanor settled into Harold's chair, the faded photograph of their wedding day visible on the side table beside her. 53 years together seemed to smile at her from the silver frame, Harold's young face confident and proud beside her own hopeful expression. "What could I possibly want from you?" she asked simply. "I'm a 78-year-old widow living alone on a mountain. You're young men with your whole lives ahead of you. Helping you costs me nothing but gives you everything." The simple observation seemed to disarm both men completely. They sat in thoughtful silence while Eleanor monitored their recovery, checking pulses and respiratory patterns with practiced efficiency. Color was returning to their faces, their breathing becoming steady and normal, their core temperatures rising toward safety. Tank broke the silence, finally, his voice carrying emotions he was clearly unaccustomed to expressing. "My grandfather used to talk about Korea, about the field hospitals where nurses worked under fire patching guys up so they could get back to their units, or at least survive long enough to go home. He said those nurses were the bravest people he ever met." Eleanor smiled at the memory of those days when she'd been young and strong and somehow convinced she was invincible, despite evidence to the contrary arriving on stretchers every few hours. "We did what needed doing, same as anyone in crisis." Tank's expression showed he was struggling to process the layers of meaning in their situation. His grandfather's unit had saved Eleanor's husband. Eleanor had saved him and Danny. The mathematical impossibility of it suggested something beyond random chance, some pattern or purpose that neither man was equipped to understand but couldn't deny. The sound of vehicles approaching on the mountain road shattered their moment of reflection. Tank and Danny tensed immediately, their bodies responding to perceived threat despite their weakened condition. Through the window, Eleanor could see headlights winding up the mountain, still distant, but definitely heading toward her cabin. "That's either the sheriff or someone from the club," Tank said grimly, his tone suggesting neither option was particularly appealing. "Either way, things are about to get complicated." Eleanor looked at both men, seeing fear in their eyes despite their tough exteriors. "Are you in danger from either group?" "The sheriff will arrest us on general principles," Danny said, his voice carrying resignation born from experience with law enforcement. "We're Hell's Angels. That's enough for most cops." Tank's expression was harder to read, layers of concern about club politics and brotherhood protocols that Eleanor couldn't fully understand. "And if anyone from the club thinks we've gone soft by accepting help from an outsider, we'll deal with whatever comes." Eleanor stood, reaching for her walking stick with deliberate movements. "You're under my roof, which makes you my responsibility. I didn't spend all day nursing you back to health just to hand you over to people who might harm you." Tank and Danny exchanged glances that spoke of shared amazement at Eleanor's complete lack of fear about consequences that should concern her deeply. In their world, unconditional protection from an outsider was unprecedented, possibly dangerous, certainly unexpected. The headlights belonged to Sheriff Wade Oakes's patrol car, followed closely by Constance Fletcher's pickup truck. Eleanor watched through her window as both vehicles parked near the abandoned motorcycles, their occupants moving with cautious urgency. Wade's hand rested on his service weapon, while Constance held her cell phone like a lifeline to emergency services. Eleanor stepped onto her front porch, her walking stick tapping against the wooden planks Harold had fitted with such care. "Good evening, Wade, Constance. You're both out late for a social call." Sheriff Oakes approached slowly, his eyes scanning the cabin for signs of trouble. At 55, Wade had served Pine Valley for 20 years without encountering anything more dangerous than drunk drivers in domestic disputes. The presence of Hell's Angels motorcycles on his quiet mountain road represented unknown territory that his training hadn't prepared him to handle. "Eleanor, we found 2 motorcycles crashed down the road." Wade's voice carried careful neutrality. "Belongs to some bikers from the Billings chapter. You seen anything unusual today?" "I found 2 injured men this morning and brought them home for medical treatment." Eleanor replied with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to describe baking bread. They were suffering from severe hypothermia and needed immediate care. Constance Fletcher gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of horror that would have been theatrical if it wasn't genuine. Eleanor, please tell me you didn't bring Hell's Angels into your house. Do you have any idea how dangerous these people are? They were unconscious and dying. Eleanor's tone remained calm but carried steel beneath the surface. I treated them the same way I would treat anyone in medical distress. Wade's expression grew stern, his law enforcement training asserting itself. Eleanor, I need to see these men immediately. There's been a string of robberies across 3 counties and Hell's Angels have been linked to several incidents. These particular individuals may be wanted for questioning. They've been unconscious most of the day from hypothermia, Eleanor explained patiently. They're certainly not in condition to rob anyone, and they're not wanted for any crimes. I asked. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of additional vehicles. Word had spread through Pine Valley's informal communication networks with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. Neighbors began gathering at the crash site, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they examined the motorcycles and speculated about what had happened. Within an hour, the peaceful mountain road resembled a crime scene. More deputies arrived from the county seat, followed by a local news crew that had monitored police scanner traffic and smelled a story. The crowd of onlookers grew to include most of Eleanor's neighbors and several town council members who had driven up to assess the situation personally. Inside the cabin, Tank and Danny could hear the commotion building outside, the murmur of crowd noise punctuated by radio chatter and shouted questions from reporters. Both men understood that their presence had created a crisis extending far beyond Eleanor's personal safety. The community was mobilizing in response to perceived threat, and their host was about to bear consequences for her compassion. We need to turn ourselves in, Tank said quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern beneath its gruff exterior. This is exactly what we were afraid would happen. You're going to get hurt because you helped us. Eleanor considered this suggestion while checking Danny's pulse and temperature one final time. His recovery was complete, though both men remained weak from their ordeal. Are you wanted for any crimes? No outstanding warrants, Danny confirmed. We were just riding home from a club meeting in Billings. Nothing illegal about that. Then there's no reason to surrender to people who are responding to fear rather than facts, Eleanor said firmly. You've done nothing wrong except have a motorcycle accident. The sound of approaching footsteps on the porch ended their discussion. Sheriff Oakes knocked firmly on the front door, his voice carrying official authority. Eleanor, I need to speak with you and any individuals currently in your residence. Eleanor opened the door to find Wade accompanied by 2 county deputies and a news reporter holding a microphone. Behind them, she could see the gathered crowd of neighbors and curiosity seekers, their faces illuminated by harsh television camera lights. Sheriff, these men are my guests, and they're recovering from medical treatment, Eleanor said before Wade could speak. They're not under arrest, and they're not suspects in any crime. They had a motorcycle accident and required emergency care. The news reporter immediately began asking questions, her voice carrying the sensational tone that suggested a predetermined narrative regardless of facts. Mrs. Whitmore, aren't you concerned about harboring dangerous criminals? What message does this send to law-abiding citizens who expect protection from these gang members? Eleanor's response was measured and clear, her voice cutting through the noise with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. I see 2 young men who were injured and needed help. Their clothing and affiliations don't change their right to medical care and basic human decency. The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some neighbors nodded approval of Eleanor's humanitarian instincts, while others expressed outrage at what they perceived as reckless endangerment of community safety. The argument spread through the gathered people, creating factions that would define the town's response for weeks to come. Constance Fletcher stepped forward as unofficial spokesperson for the concerned faction, her face showing genuine worry beneath her outrage. Eleanor, we're worried about you. These people have a reputation for violence and criminal activity. What happens when more of them come looking for their friends? Then we'll treat them with the same courtesy we show any visitors, Eleanor replied simply. Fear doesn't justify abandoning our values. Wade Oakes studied Eleanor's face, seeing stubbornness that decades of knowing her had taught him was immovable once she'd decided on a course of action. Ma'am, I can't force you to press charges or demand these men leave your property, but I am going to post a deputy nearby tonight just in case. That's unnecessary, but I won't stop you from doing your job, Eleanor said. These men are welcome to stay until they're fully recovered. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the rumble of motorcycle engines approaching from down the mountain. The sound started as distant thunder, growing louder with each passing second, resolving into the distinctive Harley-Davidson roar that made the crowd fall silent with collective apprehension. Tank and Danny heard it instantly, their bodies going rigid with tension that had nothing to do with lingering effects of hypothermia. Through the window, both men could see headlights approaching multiple motorcycles traveling in formation with the disciplined precision that marked official club business rather than casual riding. That's Iron Mike, Tank said quietly, his voice carrying layers of meaning Eleanor couldn't fully interpret. The club found us. 8 motorcycles emerged from the darkness, their chrome-reflecting camera lights as they arranged themselves in Eleanor's driveway with choreographed precision. The riders wore leather jackets bearing the same distinctive patches. Tank and Danny displayed their presence, transforming the situation from small-town drama to something potentially explosive. The man in the lead was massive, his gray beard and weathered face speaking of decades spent living outside conventional society's boundaries. Iron Mike Donovan dismounted his motorcycle with deliberate movements, his eyes sweeping the scene with tactical awareness, born from a lifetime of reading situations for threat potential. Eleanor stepped off her porch without hesitation, her walking stick providing support as she walked directly toward 8 of the most feared men in the region. Behind Iron Mike, the other riders remained mounted but alert, their postures communicating readiness for violence if circumstances demanded it. "You the lady who's been taking care of my boys." Iron Mike's voice carried gravelly authority, decades of command audible in every word. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore, and yes, I've been providing medical care for Tank and Danny," she replied firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "They were suffering from severe hypothermia when I found them." Iron Mike's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, weighing it against whatever intelligence he'd gathered during his search. Medical care. That what we're calling it? His tone suggested skepticism about Eleanor's motives, as if kindness itself was suspect. Tank appeared in the doorway behind Eleanor, still wearing Harold's oversized flannel robe, moving with renewed strength despite the ordeal he had survived. "Mike, she saved our lives. Danny and me would have died out there if she hadn't found us." Iron Mike studied Tank's appearance, noting the domestic scene that contradicted every assumption about Hell's Angels protocol and acceptable behavior. His eyes moved from Tank to Eleanor to the gathered crowd of townspeople and law enforcement, calculating angles and assessing threat levels with practiced efficiency. "That what happened, Tank?" Iron Mike's question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. "You and Danny couldn't handle a little road ice." Danny joined them on the porch, his artistic sensitivity making him acutely aware of emotional undercurrents flowing between club members. "Weather turned bad fast, Mike. We hit black ice coming around Devil's Curve. Bikes went down hard and we were unconscious for hours in freezing temperatures." Iron Mike's assessment of the situation seemed to reach some internal conclusion as he stepped closer to Eleanor, his massive frame casting shadows across her porch. "Mrs. Whitmore, you got brass doing what you did. Most people would have kept walking or called authorities and washed their hands of it. Most people aren't nurses with field hospital experience," Eleanor replied simply. "Emergency medical care doesn't distinguish between deserving and undeserving patients." Something in her tone made Iron Mike pause, his expression shifting as new information registered. "Field hospital. You serve. Korea. 2 years at a MASH unit near the 38th parallel. Treated casualties from both sides." Iron Mike's entire demeanor changed as military service created unexpected common ground. His own Army background from Vietnam provided framework for understanding Eleanor's perspective in ways that transcended their obvious differences. "You treated enemy soldiers." His question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "I treated human beings who were dying," Eleanor corrected gently. "Wounded soldiers don't have nationalities. They have needs." The crowd had fallen silent watching this improbable conversation between an elderly widow and a Hells Angels chapter president. Wade Oakes kept his hand near his weapon, but his posture had relaxed slightly, recognizing that immediate violence seemed unlikely. Iron Mike studied Eleanor's face, seeing character that his decades of reading people told him was genuine. Mrs. Whitmore, I came here expecting trouble. Maybe to retrieve my members from jail, maybe to negotiate their release, maybe to deal with locals who thought they could take advantage of injured bikers. He paused, his expression showing reassessment of assumptions. What I didn't expect was someone like you. Eleanor smiled at the admission. I'm just an old woman who helps people when they need it. Nothing complicated about that. The sound of a car engine interrupted the moment, a sensible sedan pulling into Eleanor's driveway with cautious speed. Tank's entire body went rigid as he recognized the vehicle, his expression shifting through disbelief to alarm to something approaching panic. The car door opened and a woman emerged, her movements showing the controlled urgency of someone who had been driving fast and was now forcing herself to appear calm. She was in her late 30s, attractive in the way of women who had learned to armor themselves against disappointment. Behind her, a child's face appeared in the back window, small and curious and completely innocent of the tension surrounding her arrival. Lydia, Tank's voice came as barely audible whisper. And Cora, what are they doing here? Lydia's eyes swept across the scene, taking in the motorcycles, the crowd, the news cameras, and finally fixing on Eleanor with an expression mixing gratitude and deep concern. She moved toward the porch with protective instincts overriding whatever reservations she had about the situation. I got a call from the sheriff's office that Marcus was in an accident. Lydia's voice trembled slightly, despite her efforts to maintain composure. They said he was here. Is he all right? Cora had already spotted her father on the porch, her 8-year-old face lighting up with joy that made Tank's eyes well with tears he tried to hide. She bounded out of the car before Lydia could stop her, running toward the porch with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. Daddy? Cora's voice carried pure happiness, untainted by adult complications or fear of the dangerous men surrounding her father. She crashed into Tank's legs, wrapping her arms around him with the fierce love only children could express so openly. Tank knelt despite his weakened condition, pulling Cora into an embrace that seemed to compress 8 months of separation into a single moment. His massive hands trembled as they held her, his face buried in her hair, as emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel broke through his carefully maintained exterior. Hey, sweetheart, Tank's voice came rough with feeling. I'm okay. Just had a little accident on the ice. The gathered crowd watched this scene with visible surprise, seeing vulnerability in one of the feared bikers that contradicted every assumption about who these men were. Even the news cameras captured the moment, though the footage would tell a story more complex than simple narratives about dangerous gang members. Iron Mike observed Tank's reunion with his daughter, his weathered face showing something approaching tenderness beneath its intimidating exterior. He stepped back, giving them space, his body language communicating to his members that this moment was sacred, protected by brotherhood, codes that valued family above all else. Eleanor watched Lydia's face, seeing the internal war between wanting Cora to have a relationship with her father and fearing the world he inhabited. Mrs. Whitmore, Lydia's tone carried careful respect. Thank you for taking care of Marcus. I know he can be difficult. He's been nothing but grateful and respectful, Eleanor replied warmly, and concerned about his friend Danny, which speaks well of his character. Lydia's expression suggested she was struggling to reconcile this description with the man she'd divorced 3 years ago, the one whose drinking and club involvement had made family life impossible. People change, I suppose. Her voice carried hope warring with doubt. The moment of peace was shattered by a voice from the crowd, elderly and sharp with pain that years hadn't diminished. That's the man who killed my husband. The gathering fell silent as heads turned toward the speaker. Mrs. Patterson stood at the edge of the crowd, her weathered hands gripping a cane, her face showing grief that had become permanent fixture of her features. At 76, she carried herself with the dignified anger of someone who had lost everything that mattered and refused to pretend otherwise. Tank's face went pale as recognition struck. He gently released Cora, standing to face Mrs. Patterson with an expression mixing shame and regret so profound it was painful to witness. His entire body seemed to collapse inward, the intimidating exterior crumbling to reveal the broken man underneath. Mrs. Patterson, Tank's voice came barely above whisper. I'm so sorry. The crowd watched with collective held breath as Mrs. Patterson, moved slowly toward the porch, her cane tapping against asphalt with rhythm that sounded like judgment being delivered one measured step at a time. Eleanor moved to intercept her, concerned about confrontation that could turn violent given the emotional charge crackling through the air. "Carolyn," Eleanor said gently, using Mrs. Patterson's first name, "perhaps this isn't the time or place." Mrs. Patterson stopped, her eyes never leaving Tank's face. "When is the time, Eleanor? When is it appropriate for me to face the man who drove drunk and killed Thomas, who took my husband of 53 years and left me with nothing but memories in an empty house?" Tank's tears flowed freely now, his tough exterior completely dissolved by confrontation with consequences he'd carried for 10 years but never properly faced. "Mrs. Patterson, I was drunk. I was angry at the world, and I got behind the wheel when I shouldn't have. I killed your husband and destroyed your life. Nothing I say will ever make that right." Cora watched her father with wide eyes, seeing him in a way she never had before, witnessing the weight of guilt he carried beneath his tough exterior. Lydia pulled Cora close protectively, but the child resisted, sensing something important was happening that she needed to witness. "You served 18 months in prison." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried bitter precision. 18 months for 53 years of marriage. 18 months for the man who built our house with his own hands, who read to me every night before bed, who made me laugh every single day. "I know." Tank's voice broke completely. "I know it wasn't enough. I know nothing could ever be enough." Eleanor stepped forward, positioning herself between Tank and Mrs. Patterson, though her small frame provided little physical barrier. "Caroline, what happened was a tragedy. Marcus has carried that guilt every day for 10 years. He's paid the legal price, but the real price never ends." Mrs. Patterson's anger seemed to waver as she looked at Eleanor, seeing her friend's face pleading for something that went against every justified desire for retribution. "You're asking me to forgive him. I'm asking you to see him as a human being who made a terrible mistake and has spent a decade trying to be better than his worst moment." Eleanor's voice carried gentle firmness. "I'm asking you to consider whether holding on to anger helps Thomas's memory or just keeps you trapped in the worst day of your life." The silence stretched as Mrs. Patterson struggled with emotions too complex for simple resolution. Her eyes moved from Tank to Cora, seeing the child clinging to her father, and something in her expression shifted. "Thomas and I never had children." Mrs. Patterson's voice softened slightly. "It was our great regret. He would have been a wonderful father." She turned her attention to Cora, studying the girl with an expression mixing pain and something approaching tenderness. "Your father took something precious from me, but looking at you, I can see he created something precious too." Cora met Mrs. Patterson's gaze with childhood directness. "I'm sorry. Sorry about your husband. My daddy's sorry too. He cries sometimes at night when he thinks I'm asleep." The admission from such an innocent source seemed to crack something in Mrs. Patterson's armor. She looked at Tank with new assessment, seeing past her justified anger to the broken man trying desperately to be a good father despite his failures. "I can't forgive you today," Mrs. Patterson said, finally, her voice carrying exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Maybe I never will, but I won't stand in the way of Eleanor helping you. God knows she's helped me through my darkest times." Tank nodded, accepting this limited grace with visible relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I don't deserve even that much." Mrs. Patterson turned to leave, but paused, her cane tapping once against the porch steps. Marcus, her use of his given name rather than labels like that man or the drunk driver, carried significance everyone recognized. Thomas believed people could change. He believed in redemption. "I'm not there yet, but I'm trying to honor what he believed." She walked away slowly, the crowd parting to let her through. The confrontation had shifted something in the gathered townspeople, adding complexity to their simple narratives about dangerous bikers and reckless elderly women. They had witnessed genuine remorse and hesitant forgiveness, human drama that transcended easy categorization. Iron Mike had watched the entire exchange with visible emotion, his own past likely containing moments of regret and consequences that never fully resolved. He approached Eleanor with new respect evident in his movements. "Mrs. Whitmore, I came here tonight prepared to take my boys home, maybe have words with locals who thought they could judge us." He paused, his voice carrying unusual vulnerability. What I'm seeing here is something I don't fully understand but can't dismiss. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. What you're seeing is what happens when people treat each other as human beings instead of categories. Tank and Danny needed help. Mrs. Patterson needed to confront her grief. Cora needed to see her father. All of it is just people trying to navigate being alive. Iron Mike nodded slowly, his expression showing the beginning of fundamental shift in thinking about Motorcycle Club, purpose, and identity. My boys can stay the night, finish their recovery. But Mrs. Whitmore, you need to understand something about the world you're getting involved in. I understand more than you think, Eleanor replied calmly. I understand that brotherhood and loyalty matter to you. I understand that society has pushed many of you to the margins, and you've created your own code to survive. I also understand that beneath all the leather and patches, you're men who want purpose and belonging. Iron Mike studied her face, seeing wisdom that his decades of experience told him was genuine. You served in Korea. You know what it's like when nobody at home understands what you've been through. When the only people who get it are the ones who were there with you. Eleanor nodded. Harold came back from World War II with nightmares that never fully went away. I came back from Korea with my own. We built a life together, but there were parts of ourselves we could only share with each other because civilians couldn't understand. That's what the club is for a lot of us. Iron Mike's voice carried conviction mixed with something approaching defensiveness. We're not just criminals. We're brothers who have each other's backs when nobody else will. I don't doubt that, Eleanor said gently. But brotherhood should build people up, not just protect them from consequences. Tank and Danny could be so much more than enforcers for a motorcycle club. Iron Mike's expression hardened slightly. They're not enforcers. They're respected members who've earned their places through loyalty and courage. Tank stepped forward, his voice stronger now, despite the emotional ordeal he had just survived. Mike, she's right. I've been using the club as an excuse not to deal with my guilt over the accident, hiding behind brotherhood instead of facing what I did and trying to make amends. The admission created visible tension among the Hells Angels members who had been watching silently. Questioning club dynamics or suggesting the brotherhood wasn't enough bordered on disloyalty, the kind of weakness that could undermine hierarchy and cohesion. Danny joined Tank, his artistic sensitivity, giving him words for feelings Tank struggled to express. The club saved our lives when we had nothing else. But maybe Eleanor is showing us that serving something bigger than ourselves could give us purpose the club can't provide. Iron Mike's face showed internal struggle as his members' words challenged assumptions he'd built an entire identity around. He looked from Tank and Danny to Eleanor to Cora, still clinging to her father, seeing transformation beginning to take root in ways that threatened and intrigued him equally. This conversation isn't over, Iron Mike said finally, but it's late and you're both still recovering. We ride out tomorrow morning, but Mrs. Whitmore, I expect we'll be seeing more of you. The Hells Angels members remounted their motorcycles in synchronized movements, engines roaring to life with thunder that made Cora cover her ears while grinning with delight. Iron Mike was the last to mount his eyes, meeting Eleanor's one final time before he signaled the departure. As the motorcycle convoy disappeared down the mountain road, the crowd of townspeople began dispersing with considerably less hostility than they'd arrived with. They had witnessed something unexpected: humanity in the midst of fear, forgiveness beginning where anger should reign, transformation starting in the least likely place. Sheriff Oakes approached Eleanor as the last neighbors drove away. Ma'am, I still think you're taking unnecessary risks, but I can't deny what I saw here tonight made me reconsider some assumptions. Good, Eleanor replied with a smile. Assumptions are dangerous things. They prevent us from seeing what's actually in front of us. Wade nodded, tipping his hat in respect before returning to his patrol car. The news crew had already left their cameras capturing footage that would run on evening broadcasts across the region, telling stories about the Angel of Pine Valley and the bikers she'd saved. Lydia brought Cora over to say goodbye, the child's face showing exhaustion from excitement and late hour. Can Daddy come visit us soon? Cora asked Eleanor, as if the elderly woman somehow controlled the universe. That depends on your father's recovery and your mother's comfort level, Eleanor replied diplomatically. But I think seeing each other more often would be good for everyone. Lydia's expression showed she was reconsidering restrictions she'd maintained for 3 years, seeing changes in Marcus that therapy and court orders had failed to produce. Maybe we could arrange regular visits. Her voice carried tentative hope. If he stays clean and continues working on himself. Tank embraced Cora one more time before Lydia led her back to the car. The child waved enthusiastically as they drove away. Her innocent joy, a sharp contrast to the heavy drama that had surrounded her brief visit. Inside the cabin, Eleanor finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that 18 hours of crisis management had created. Tank and Danny sat at her kitchen table, both men looking drained but somehow more alive than when she'd found them that morning. "You saved our lives," Danny said quietly. "But more than that, you gave us a chance to be better than we thought we could be." Tank nodded in agreement, his massive hands wrapped around a mug of tea that looked fragile in his grip. "That thing with Mrs. Patterson, I've been carrying that guilt for 10 years but never faced her directly. You made me do what I should have done long ago." Eleanor settled into Harold's chair, feeling her husband's presence in the room where so many important conversations had taken place. "I didn't make you do anything. I just created space for honesty. The rest was your choice." The wooden cross Harold had carved sat on the windowsill, catching moonlight that made it seem to glow with internal light. Eleanor picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wood her husband's hands had shaped with such care. "Harold made this during his last winter." Eleanor's voice carried grief and love in equal measure. "He said faith meant nothing if it couldn't be shared, if it didn't move us to help others, even when it cost us something." She held the cross out to Tank, whose eyes widened with surprise. "I can't take something that personal." "Harold would want you to have it," Eleanor insisted gently. "He believed in redemption, believed people could change if given the right combination of accountability and grace. You're living proof he was right." Tank accepted the cross with trembling hands, his tough exterior completely dissolved by the weight of undeserved gift and unconditional acceptance. He traced the carved surfaces, feeling the love embedded in Harold's craftsmanship. Danny pulled out his sketch pad, the one he carried everywhere, and began drawing Eleanor's face in profile as she tended the wood stove. His artistic talent captured not just her physical features, but the serenity that came from a life lived according to clear principles. "Nobody ever took care of me like you did," Danny said quietly as he drew. "I wanted you to have something to remember us by." He tore the page from his sketch pad and handed it to Eleanor with awkward ceremony. The drawing revealed her through Danny's perspective, showing strength and kindness and wisdom earned through decades of choosing love over fear. "This is beautiful work." Eleanor studied the portrait with genuine appreciation. "You have considerable talent, Danny. Have you considered formal training?" Danny's laugh carried bitter undertones. "Foster kids don't get art school. We get survival skills and early independence. I'm lucky the club values my mechanical abilities enough to keep me fed and housed." "Talent doesn't respect circumstances," Eleanor observed. "Harold would have appreciated your eye for detail and proportion. He was a craftsman himself." She stood moving to the kitchen cabinet where Harold's old journals were stored, leather-bound notebooks filled with 50 years of thoughts and observations. She pulled out one from 1952, its pages yellowed but still legible. "Listen to this." Eleanor read aloud, her voice carrying Harold's words across the decades. "Today, Eleanor told me about the North Korean soldier she treated, the one who kept calling for his mother while she worked to save his life. She said she couldn't understand his words, but knew exactly what he was saying, because pain speaks a universal language. I think that's what makes her special. She sees humanity first, everything else second." Tank and Danny sat in silence as Eleanor's words hung in the air, connecting past to present in ways that seemed designed by something larger than coincidence. Harold spent 30 years after the war trying to find the Marines who saved him. Eleanor continued returning the journal to its place. He wanted to thank them properly, to tell them that the life they gave back to him was a good one full of love and purpose. He died never knowing their name. She turned to Tank, her eyes bright with tears. "Your grandfather gave Harold decades of happiness with me, gave him the chance to build this cabin, to serve this community, to create a life that mattered. And now, 50 years later, I get to return that gift by saving his grandson." The mathematics of it seemed impossible. the probability so remote it suggested divine intervention, or cosmic poetry, or simple proof that the universe bent toward justice when given enough time. We should let you rest. Tank said, finally recognizing that Eleanor had been operating on pure adrenaline for 18 hours and needed sleep. But Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor, thank you doesn't begin to cover what we owe you. You owe me nothing, Eleanor replied firmly. But if you want to honor what I've done, then honor it by being better men tomorrow than you were yesterday. Honor it by treating others with the dignity I showed you. Honor it by remembering that every person you meet is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who matters to somebody. She walked them to the guest room where Harold used to work on his woodworking projects, now converted to sleeping space with 2 simple beds. The room still smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil, Harold's presence lingering in the tools that hung on the walls. Sleep well, Eleanor said from the doorway. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next. As she prepared for bed in the room she'd shared with Harold for 50 years, Eleanor felt his absence more acutely than usual, wishing she could tell him about the impossible day that had unfolded, about finding Tank and Danny, about the confrontation with Mrs. Patterson, about Iron Mike, and the choices ahead. But Harold was gone, his voice silent, except in memory and journal entries. Eleanor touched the photograph on her nightstand, the one of them on their wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unprepared for the life they would build together. I found them, Harold, she whispered to the image. Found the grandson of the man who saved you. The universe gave us a chance to complete the circle. The mountain night settled over the cabin with peaceful silence that felt earned after the chaos of the day. Inside, 3 people slept in beds that represented sanctuary and transformation, in the beginning of something none of them fully understood yet. Outside, Pine Valley absorbed the news that one of their own had saved 2 Hell's Angels and confronted the entire community about fear and judgment and the difference between justice and vengeance. The story would spread through phones and coffee shops and church gatherings, dividing people into camps that would define local politics for months to come. But in Eleanor Whitmore's cabin, surrounded by Harold's craftsmanship and 50 years of accumulated love, 3 souls rested in the knowledge that sometimes the most important moments arrived without warning, requiring nothing more than willingness to respond with whatever resources were at hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions about what it meant for an elderly widow and 2 motorcycle club members to forge alliance that defied social boundaries. Tomorrow, Iron Mike would return with expectations and demands that would test Eleanor's resolve and Tank and Danny's transformation. Tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson would wake with the weight of her declaration that she was trying to honor Thomas's belief in redemption, wondering if forgiveness was really possible or just pretty words that couldn't survive contact with genuine grief. Tomorrow, Cora would ask her mother questions about why Daddy lived with scary people and whether they could visit the nice lady on the mountain again soon. Tomorrow, Sheriff Oakes would field calls from concerned citizens and write reports that tried to explain the inexplicable, how crisis had revealed humanity in the midst of fear. But tonight, Eleanor Whitmore slept peacefully for the first time since Harold's death, feeling purpose return to a life that had seemed complete, not realizing that saving Tank and Danny was just the beginning of a journey that would transform an entire community and challenge everything everyone thought they knew about redemption, brotherhood, and the power of unconditional love. 6 months had passed since Eleanor Whitmore pulled 2 frozen Hell's Angels from the edge of death, and Pine Valley had learned to live with the unlikely alliance that had formed on that bitter winter morning. The town adapted the way small communities always do, incorporating the strange into the fabric of normal life until it wasn't strange anymore. Tank's Harley-Davidson became a familiar sight on Eleanor's mountain road, the rumble of its engine now associated with a security rather than threat. He came twice a week ostensibly to help with heavy maintenance around the cabin, but really because Eleanor's presence had become necessary to him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. She was part therapist, part mother figure, part moral compass, pointing him toward a version of himself he'd forgotten could exist. Danny visited even more frequently, his artistic talent, finding unexpected outlet in Eleanor's encouragement. The sketch pad he carried everywhere now contained not just mechanical drawings and abstract designs, but portraits of community members' landscapes that captured Pine Valley's beauty and studies of Eleanor's cabin that revealed his growing appreciation for craftsmanship and permanence. Eleanor's kitchen table had become unofficial headquarters for transformations that rippled outward from that February morning. Tank brought Cora every other weekend, the visits sanctioned by Lydia, who had witnessed enough change in Marcus to cautiously trust his newfound stability. Danny joined them for these family dinners, his presence filling the role of uncle or older brother, providing Cora with the extended family structure neither man had experienced themselves. The wooden cross Harold had carved occupied a place of honor on that kitchen table, its smooth surface catching light from the window and serving as silent reminder of faith in human potential for change. Tank touched it sometimes during difficult conversations, the physical connection to Harold's belief in redemption providing anchor when his own faith wavered. Iron Mike Donovan had kept his word about staying in contact, though his presence brought complications Eleanor hadn't fully anticipated. The Hells Angels chapter president appeared monthly, supposedly to check on Tank and Danny's recovery, but really to observe the transformation Eleanor was engineering. He watched with the wariness of someone seeing familiar patterns, disrupted brotherhood dynamics, shifting in ways that threatened and intrigued him equally. The Pine Valley community had divided roughly into thirds regarding Eleanor's activities. One faction, led by Constance Fletcher, maintained that harboring dangerous criminals endangered everyone, and Eleanor's compassion was misguided at best, recklessly naive at worst. Another faction, smaller but vocal, celebrated Eleanor as embodiment of Christian charity and proof that redemption was possible for even the most hardened criminals. The largest group occupied the ambivalent, middle, uncomfortable with Hells Angels' presence, but unable to deny the measurable improvements in Tank and Danny's behavior. These were men who attended Cora's school functions, who helped elderly neighbors with yard work, who stopped when they saw stranded motorists and offered assistance rather than threat. Sheriff Oakes had become a reluctant ally, his initial suspicion giving way to cautious cooperation as months passed without incident. Tank and Danny had proven reliable sources of information about criminal activity in the region, their club connections providing intelligence that led to arrests of actual troublemakers who made Hells Angels look tame by comparison. On a warm August morning, Eleanor sat on her porch watching Tank teach Cora how to identify edible plants in the forest surrounding the cabin. His massive hands were gentle as he showed her the difference between wild strawberries and similar-looking poisonous berries, his patience infinite when she asked the same questions multiple times. Danny worked in the corner of the porch that had become his outdoor studio, sketching Cora and Tank with quick, confident strokes that captured the tenderness of their interaction. His art had evolved considerably in 6 months' technique, sharpening through constant practice, and Eleanor's encouragement to take risks with subject matter and composition. "You've gotten better," Eleanor observed, looking over Danny's shoulder at the sketch taking shape. "Have you considered formal training?" Danny's smile carried less bitterness than it would have months ago, though doubt still edged his voice. "At 32 with a criminal record and no high school diploma, art schools don't exactly recruit people like me. Community college has open enrollment." Eleanor pointed out her tone, suggesting she'd already researched this option. "Financial aid for students who demonstrate talent and commitment. You have both." The idea clearly appealed to Danny despite his instinctive resistance to hope. His fingers traced the drawing, seeing in his own work evidence that Eleanor might be right about his potential. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple motorcycle engines approaching from down the mountain. The distinctive Harley rumble multiplied into chorus that made Tank's head snap up from his botany lesson with Cora. His expression shifted instantly from relaxed father to alert club member, reading threat levels in the rhythm of engines and formation of approaching bikes. "That's not our chapter," Tank said quietly, his body moving to position himself between Cora and the road. "Danny, get Eleanor and Cora inside." Danny was already moving his artist's sensitivity to emotional undercurrents, telling him this wasn't a casual visit. He ushered Eleanor and Cora toward the cabin door while Tank stood on the porch steps, his posture shifting to the aggressive confidence that came from years of navigating motorcycle club politics. 20 motorcycles emerged from the tree line, their chrome and leather creating intimidating display of organized power. The riders wore Hells Angels patches, but different territorial identifiers than Tank and Danny's Pine Ridge chapter. Riverside was stenciled on their jackets, the chapter notorious for violent resistance to any perceived weakness among brother clubs. The lead rider was massive even by motorcycle club standards, his presence commanding attention through pure physical dominance. Leather vests showed patches indicating chapter president status, along with decorations suggesting decades of service and violence. His face bore scars that told stories of confrontations, survived lessons learned through pain. Eleanor watched through the window as the Riverside chapter arranged themselves in her driveway with military precision. 20 men in their prime armed with attitude and reputation that made Pine Valley's concerns about Tank and Danny seem quaint by comparison. "Stay inside," Tank called over his shoulder, his voice carrying authority Eleanor hadn't heard from him before. "This is club business. I don't take orders in my own home," Eleanor replied calmly, already moving toward the door. "If they're here to discuss you and Danny, then I'm part of this conversation." Tank started to protest but recognized futility when he saw Eleanor's expression. 6 months of knowing her had taught him that she followed her own moral compass, regardless of danger or social conventions. The Riverside chapter president dismounted his bike with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated to project authority and barely controlled violence. At 45, Reaper Blake Morrison had built reputation on swift retaliation against anyone who challenged club traditions or territorial boundaries. "Well, look at this." Reaper's voice carried mockery across Eleanor's yard. "Heard stories about Tank and Sticks playing house with some old lady, but had to see it for myself." Danny appeared in the doorway beside Tank, his lean frame less physically intimidating than Tank's bulk, but his presence communicating loyalty that transcended self-preservation. Behind them, Eleanor emerged with Cora held securely by the hand, her walking stick tapping against the porch planks, with Harold's confidence embedded in the carved wood. Reaper's eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene, 2 of Iron Mike's members in defensive posture, an elderly woman showing no fear, a young girl watching everything with wide-eyed curiosity. Whatever he'd expected, this domestic tableau wasn't it. "You must be Mrs. Whitmore." Reaper's tone shifted, respect creeping in despite his aggressive entrance. "Heard a lot about you. Some of it even sounds true." "Mr. Morrison, I assume?" Eleanor replied with the same courtesy she'd show any visitor. "Would you and your members like coffee? It's fresh." The offer of refreshment during what was clearly a confrontation created visible confusion among the Riverside members. Several exchanged glances that suggested they were questioning whether Eleanor was naive or operating on a level of social confidence they couldn't interpret. "We're not here for coffee, ma'am," Reaper said, though his tone had lost some of its edge. "We're here to discuss whether the Pine Ridge chapter has forgotten what it means to be Hells Angels." Tank stepped forward, his body language communicating readiness for violence despite his preference to avoid it. "Reaper, we're running our chapter according to Iron Mike's decisions. If you've got issues with that, take them up with him." "Already did." Reaper pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, scrolling through messages. "Mike says you boys have been transformed by an angel on the mountain. Says you're teaching Pine Ridge a new way to operate. Says maybe other chapters should consider your approach." The revelation that Iron Mike had been discussing their situation with other chapter presidents created surprise visible on Tank and Danny's faces. They'd assumed their arrangement with Eleanor was local matter, not template for regional discussion. "What Mike's doing here is making us look weak." Reaper continued, his voice hardening again. "Hells Angels don't cooperate with civilians. We don't take orders from elderly women. We sure as hell don't let our members play dad and artist while forgetting what brotherhood really means." Eleanor felt Cora's hand tighten in hers, the child sensing danger in adult conversation. She gently released Cora to Danny, who immediately moved her further from the confrontation while staying close enough to intervene if necessary. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly do you think brotherhood means?" Eleanor asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational. "Because from where I stand, Tank and Danny have shown loyalty and courage that honor their club rather than diminish it." Reaper studied Eleanor with growing interest, seeing steel beneath her grandmotherly exterior. "Ma'am, with respect, you don't understand the world we live in. Brotherhood means having each other's backs when the whole world is against us. It means never showing weakness that enemies can exploit. I understand more than you think, Eleanor replied calmly. I spent 2 years in a field hospital during the Korean War. I know exactly what brotherhood looks like when people are dying, and the only thing that matters is trust in the person beside you. The mention of military service created slight shift in Reaper's demeanor, his own army background from Iraq providing framework for understanding her perspective. But that was war. This is different. Is it? Eleanor moved down the porch steps with slow, deliberate movements that projected confidence rather than frailty. Because it seems to me you're all still fighting, still treating the world as hostile territory, still convinced that showing humanity makes you vulnerable. One of the Riverside members, younger than Reaper, but carrying himself with similar aggressive confidence, stepped forward. His face bore tattoos that suggested prison time and violence enthusiastically embraced. Lady, you got no idea what you're talking about. We're outlaws. We don't play nice with civilians. Then why are you here? Eleanor asked simply. If you're so confident in your approach, why does it bother you that Tank and Danny are trying something different? The question hung in the air, its logic difficult to refute. Reaper's expression showed he was reassessing the situation, seeing that Eleanor wasn't naive civilian who could be intimidated, but someone operating from different value system entirely. Because if other chapters start thinking cooperation makes them stronger, the whole foundation of what we are starts crumbling. Reaper's voice carried genuine concern beneath its aggressive tone. We're Hell's Angels. We're one percenters. We exist outside society's rules because society rejected us first. Did it reject you, or did you reject it? Eleanor's question carried gentle challenge. Because Tank and Danny have shown me that society is perfectly willing to accept Hell's Angels members who contribute rather than threaten. Tank moved to stand beside Eleanor, his presence protective but not aggressive. Reaper, 6 months ago, I was drinking myself to death, sending money to my daughter, but never seeing her carrying guilt that was eating me alive. Eleanor gave me a reason to be better than my worst moments. Danny joined them, his artistic sensitivity, giving him words for feelings that Tank struggled to express. The club saved our lives when we had nothing. But Eleanor showed us that serving something bigger than ourselves gives purpose the club can't provide alone. Reaper's jaw tightened as he processed their words, seeing transformation that challenged everything his identity was built around. You sound like you're leaving the club. Never. Tank's voice carried conviction. The club is family, but family should help you grow, not keep you trapped in patterns that destroy you. The conversation was interrupted by new arrival, a single motorcycle approaching from the direction of town. The rider wore Riverside patches but moved with urgency that suggested this wasn't casual joining of the group confrontation. The newcomer dismounted quickly, moving directly to Reaper, with body language communicating news that couldn't wait. He spoke quietly, but Eleanor caught fragments. Victor Hospital critical. Reaper's expression shifted instantly from aggressive posturing to genuine alarm. He turned to his members, issuing rapid commands that had 20 motorcycles starting in synchronized roar. But before mounting his own bike, he looked back at Eleanor and Danny with strange intensity. Sticks! Reaper's use of Danny's road name carried weight that made everyone pay attention. You got family in my chapter. Victor Merrick, he's your mother's brother. Danny went completely still, the color draining from his face as impossible information crashed into carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past. My mother's brother died years ago. She told me before she overdosed. Victor thought you died too. Reaper's voice carried complexity that suggested long history. He's been looking for you since you aged out of foster care. Found your mother too late, couldn't find you. When he heard about Sticks with the Pine Ridge chapter, started putting pieces together but wasn't sure. The revelation hung in the air like physical presence, rewriting Danny's understanding of his own history. He had family, real blood family, a person who had been searching for him while he convinced himself nobody in the world cared whether he lived or died. Is he going to be okay? Danny's voice came small and vulnerable, the tough exterior completely dissolved. Car accident, critical but stable. Reaper's expression showed genuine concern beneath his intimidating facade. He'll want to see you when he wakes up. Danny looked at Eleanor, seeking guidance from the woman who had become his anchor in turbulent world. Eleanor nodded encouragement, seeing that this unexpected family connection could be healing or devastating, depending on how it unfolded. Go, Eleanor said gently. Find out who your uncle is. Learn about your mother from someone who loved her. Tank stepped forward, addressing Reaper directly. We're coming with Danny. This is Brotherhood 2, being there when your road brother needs support. Reaper studied Tank's face, seeing loyalty that transcended chapter politics and territorial disputes. His expression showed internal struggle as the confrontation he'd planned transformed into something requiring different response entirely. Fine. But Mrs. Whitmore, this conversation isn't over. We need to discuss what cooperation means and whether it makes us stronger or weaker. Eleanor smiled at the admission. Mr. Morrison, I look forward to continuing this discussion. But first help Danny find his family. The Riverside chapter departed with less hostility than they'd arrived their formation, now including Tank and Danny, whose loyalty to each other transcended chapter boundaries. Eleanor watched them disappear down the mountain road, Cora's hands small and warm in hers. Grandma Eleanor, is Danny going to be okay? Cora's use of the honorary title she'd adopted for Eleanor carried genuine concern. I hope so, sweetheart. But sometimes finding family means facing painful truths about where we come from. The hospital waiting room had never felt so crowded with leather and chrome. 20 Riverside members filled the space alongside Tank, creating atmosphere of controlled violence that made civilian visitors nervously retreat. Eleanor sat calmly among them, her presence somehow domesticating the threat they projected. Danny paced with artistic energy that had nowhere productive to channel his emotions, too raw for sketching, too complex for words. The nurse had told him Victor was awake, but sedated, that family could visit 2 at a time, that they should prepare for injuries that would take months to heal. Family. The word felt foreign in Danny's mouth, concept he'd abandoned at age 6 when foster care taught him that blood meant nothing compared to whoever was willing to feed you. And now this stranger, this uncle he'd never known existed, represented connection to a mother he barely remembered. Tank sat beside Eleanor, his bulk somehow protective, even in stillness. You don't have to do this alone, he said quietly to Danny. I'll come in with you if you want. Danny nodded gratefully, accepting support he would have rejected 6 months ago as sign of weakness. Eleanor had taught him that accepting help was strength, that vulnerability created bonds deeper than pretending independence. The nurse led them through sterile corridors to intensive care where Victor Merrick lay connected to machines that beeped rhythmic confirmation that his heart was still fighting. At 60, he bore the weathered appearance of someone who had lived violently and survived through luck and toughness in equal measure. His face carried scars and the kind of permanent grimness that came from seeing too much darkness. But when his eyes opened and focused on Danny, his expression transformed completely. Something like joy broke through the hardness, tears streaming down his face before he could control them. Sarah's boy. Victor's voice came rough from the breathing tube they'd recently removed. You look just like her. Same eyes, same way of holding yourself like you're ready to run, but desperately want to stay. Danny stood frozen, unable to process the emotion pouring from this stranger who claimed blood connection. My mother never mentioned you. His voice carried accusation and longing in equal measure. Your mother and I had a falling out when she married your father. Victor's words came slowly, pain from injuries mixing with emotional anguish. I was young and stupid and self-righteous. Told her she was making a mistake, that David Merrick was wrong for her. She told me to leave and never come back. Tears tracked down Victor's weathered face, decades of regret visible in how they flowed. I honored that for 10 years. By the time I came back looking for her, she was gone. Overdose. Social services said her son had been placed in foster care, but couldn't tell me where because I wasn't immediate family. He reached out with bandaged hand, the gesture tentative and heartbreaking. I've been looking for you ever since. Checked every foster kid who aged out in Montana. Searched records that were sealed. Finally heard about young artists riding with the Hells Angels guy they called Styx. Couldn't believe it might be you. Danny felt his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling as Victor's story rewrote his understanding of his own abandonment. You were looking for me. All this time, someone was looking for me. Every single day. Victor's voice broke completely. I failed your mother. I wasn't going to fail her son. Tank stood witness to the reunion, his own father wounds responding to the raw emotion filling the hospital room. He understood the power of family connection, the way it could heal or destroy depending on how people chose to wield it. Tell me about her. Danny's voice came small and young, the 32-year-old man dissolving to reveal the 6-year-old boy who barely remembered his mother's face. Tell me who she was before the drugs. Victor spent the next hour painting portrait of Sarah Merrick, Danny's mother, the woman who had loved music and art and believed she could change the world through beauty. He described her laugh, her kindness, her talent for seeing possibility in broken things. He also described her struggles with addiction that started after Danny's father left a slow decline into dependency that stole her life one compromise at a time. She loved you so much. Victor's words carried absolute conviction. Made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd find you and to make sure you knew that. Knew that her addiction didn't erase her love, that she died ashamed of what she'd become, but never stopped loving her son. Danny wept openly, grief for the mother he'd never really known mixing with rage, at all the years stolen by circumstance and miscommunication. Tank moved to stand beside him, one massive hand resting on Danny's shoulder in silent support. The moment of catharsis was interrupted by Reaper entering the room, his expression grave. We've got a problem. Victor's accident wasn't random. Someone ran him off the road deliberately. The information shifted the emotional atmosphere instantly, grief giving way to threat assessment as both chapters' members moved into defensive posture. Tank's body language changed, the protective father and loyal friend, subsumed by warrior reading tactical situations. Who and why? Tank's question was directed at Reaper, but his eyes never left the door, scanning for threats that might arrive before they could prepare. Don't know who yet. Reaper's voice carried frustrated anger. But the why might be about territorial disputes. Victor's been working on expansion into territory the Scorpions claim is theirs. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, having followed despite Danny and Tank's instructions to stay in the waiting room. Gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on ensuring Victor's safety rather than planning retaliation. Mrs. Whitmore, with all due respect, you don't understand how these disputes work. Reaper's tone carried less dismissal than it might have days ago. If we don't respond to violence against our members, we look weak. Weakness invites more violence. And if you do respond with violence, where does the cycle end? Eleanor moved into the room with steady confidence, her walking stick tapping against tile floor. Someone is always willing to escalate. The only way to win that game is not to play. Victor's eyes focused on Eleanor with sudden intensity, recognition dawning on his pain medication-affected features. You're the angel they talk about, the nurse who saved Tank and Styx. I'm Eleanor Whitmore, she replied simply. And I'm not an angel, just someone who believes people deserve better than endless cycles of violence and revenge. Victor studied her face, seeing something that made him smile despite his injuries. Sarah would have liked you. She believed in redemption too, even when she couldn't find it for herself. The conversation was interrupted by Tank's phone buzzing with incoming call. His expression shifted to alarm as he answered, his face draining of color as he listened to the voice on the other end. That was Lydia. Tank's voice came hollow and terrified. Cora's been taken. Someone grabbed her from school playground an hour ago. They're demanding I deliver Victor to them or they'll kill my daughter. The hospital room fell silent as the stakes suddenly became life or death. Someone had weaponized Tank's worst fear, turned his love for his daughter into leverage to control his actions. Danny moved to Tank's side immediately, his own family crisis subsumed by his rogue brother's need. We'll get her back, whatever it takes. Reaper's expression showed he was already calculating options and assessing resources. This is the Scorpions' play. They know Victor's value to us, know Tank's connection to him through you. They're using your daughter as pressure point. Eleanor felt cold rage settle over her, the kind of focused anger that had sustained her through field hospitals, when young men died because of decisions made by people who wouldn't face the consequences. They took a child, an innocent 8-year-old girl who has nothing to do with your territorial disputes. Which is exactly why it'll work, Reaper said grimly. Tank will do anything to get her back, including delivering Victor. Tank's hands were shaking, his entire body vibrating with barely controlled panic. His daughter, the reason he'd fought so hard to stay sober and be better, was in the hands of violent men who saw her only as leverage. We have to call the sheriff. Eleanor said firmly. This is kidnapping. Law enforcement needs to be involved. And by the time they mobilize, Cora will be dead. Reaper's voice carried brutal practicality. The Scorpions won't wait for police negotiations. They want Victor delivered in 2 hours, or they start sending pieces of your daughter. The horrific imagery made Tank stagger, his worst nightmares manifesting in real time. Danny caught him holding his road brother upright through sheer force of will and loyalty. Then we deliver Victor. Tank's voice came hollow. I won't risk Cora's life over club politics. Victor struggled to sit up despite his injuries, his face showing determination that transcended pain. You're not delivering me anywhere, but we are getting your daughter back. He turned to Reaper with authority that reminded everyone he was senior member with decades of experience. Call Iron Mike. Get every available member from both chapters mobilized. The Scorpions think they're playing power games. We're about to teach them there are lines you don't cross. Eleanor watched these dangerous men organize rescue operation with military precision, seeing brotherhood transcend chapter boundaries as common cause united them. But she also saw opportunity for something larger than simple rescue mission. Gentlemen, her voice cut through tactical planning with unexpected authority. Before you ride out for violence, consider that this might be a chance to demonstrate that cooperation is actually stronger than traditional approaches. Reaper stared at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. Mrs. Whitmore, they kidnapped a child. There's no cooperating with that. I'm not suggesting cooperation with the Scorpions, Eleanor clarified. I'm suggesting cooperation with law enforcement. Pool your intelligence about Scorpion locations with Sheriff Oak's resources. Let official channels handle arrest and prosecution while you ensure Cora's safety. The suggestion created visible resistance among the Hells Angels members, decades of antagonism with police, making collaboration feel like betrayal of core identity. But Tank's desperate expression suggested he was willing to try anything. If it gets Cora back safely, I don't care who we work with. Tank's voice carried absolute conviction. Eleanor's right that violence usually creates more problems than it solves. But I also won't let procedure slow things down if my daughter is in danger. Victor nodded slowly, his injured body responding to determination that transcended physical limitations. Reaper, make the call to Iron Mike. Mrs. Whitmore, you contact the sheriff. We coordinate both approaches and use whichever gets Cora home fastest. The next 2 hours became exercise in controlled chaos as disparate groups coordinated rescue operation. Sheriff Oakes arrived at the hospital with federal agents who specialized in kidnapping cases, their initial skepticism about Hells Angels cooperation giving way to recognition that the club's intelligence network was more extensive than official sources. Iron Mike brought 12 Pine Ridge members, his expression showing that someone threatening a child had crossed lines that activated protective instincts transcending club boundaries. The assembled force of Hells Angels from 2 chapters law enforcement at multiple levels, and 1 determined elderly woman represented cooperation that should have been impossible. Eleanor coordinated communications, her military hospital experience, providing framework for managing complex operations with multiple moving parts. She forced everyone to share information rather than hoard it, to plan together, rather than work parallel tracks that might interfere with each other. The Scorpions' location was identified through combination of Hells Angels intelligence and law enforcement surveillance. An abandoned warehouse in industrial district, perfect for holding hostages while demanding ransom. Federal agents prepared tactical entry while Hells Angels members positioned around perimeter to prevent escape. Tank was forbidden from direct participation, his emotional state making him liability, despite his desperate desire to rescue Cora himself. Danny stayed with him, providing support that kept his road brother from doing something reckless that would endanger everyone. Eleanor insisted on being part of the staging area, her medical skills potentially necessary if Cora was injured. Sheriff Oakes initially protested, but recognized that arguing with Eleanor Whitmore was waste of time better spent on actual tactical planning. The raid happened with precision that came from genuine cooperation between groups that normally treated each other as adversaries. Federal agents breached the warehouse, while Hells Angels members prevented Scorpions from escaping through back exits. The operation took 12 minutes from breach to all clear, resulting in 17 arrests and 0 casualties. Cora emerged physically unharmed, but emotionally traumatized, her 8-year-old face showing terror that would take years of therapy to fully process. Tank swept her into his arms with desperate relief, his tough exterior completely dissolved by the reality of nearly losing his daughter. Eleanor checked Cora thoroughly, her nurse's assessment confirming no physical injuries beyond bruises from restraints. But the emotional damage was visible in how Cora clung to her father, in how she flinched at sudden movements, in how trauma had stolen the innocent joy that had defined her personality. "You're safe now, sweetheart." Eleanor's voice carried gentle certainty as she examined Cora. "Nobody's going to hurt you again." The aftermath of the rescue operation brought unexpected unity to groups that had been adversarial hours before. Federal agents acknowledged that Hell's Angels intelligence had been crucial to success. Sheriff Oaks admitted that cooperation produced better outcomes than confrontation. Even Reaper looked at Eleanor with new respect. "Mrs. Whitmore, I came here ready to prove your cooperation model was weakness." Reaper's voice carried rare humility. "Watching how you coordinated this rescue, how you got everyone working together instead of fighting over jurisdiction, I'm starting to think maybe you're onto something." Eleanor accepted the acknowledgement without triumphalism. "Mr. Morrison, I'm just applying lessons learned from watching people die because ego and pride prevented necessary cooperation. Brotherhood shouldn't be limited to people wearing same patches." Victor watched from his hospital bed as the unlikely alliance began to dissolve back into constituent parts, everyone returning to normal roles and relationships. But something had shifted, proving that cooperation could achieve what isolated approaches couldn't. Tank held Cora in waiting room while medical staff checked her one final time, his face showing gratitude mixed with determination. "This changes things." His voice carried conviction that made everyone pay attention. "The club gave me brotherhood when I had nothing. But Eleanor showed me that brotherhood can be bigger than just the people wearing same colors." Danny nodded agreement, his recent reunion with Victor adding emotional weight to Tank's observation. "We've been treating the world like it's against us, when really we've been isolating ourselves by refusing to connect with anyone outside the club." Iron Mike had been silent through most of the operation, but now he spoke with authority that came from decades leading men who needed purpose and direction. The Pine Ridge chapter is going to continue working with Mrs. Whitmore's model. Cooperation with law enforcement where it makes sense. Contributing to community instead of just taking from it. Being protectors instead of predators. Reaper studied Iron Mike's face, seeing conviction that couldn't be dismissed as temporary emotion. "And if other chapters think that makes you weak, then they can come discuss it with me directly." Iron Mike's voice carried steel beneath its calm tone. "But they better bring facts instead of assumptions, because today proved that cooperation saved a child's life, while traditional approach would have gotten her killed." The two chapter presidents regarded each other with new respect, the beginning of alliance that would reshape regional Hells Angels dynamics in ways neither fully understood yet. Eleanor felt exhaustion wash over her as adrenaline from the crisis began to fade. She'd been operating on pure will for hours, her 78-year-old body protesting exertions that would challenge someone half her age. She sat down heavily in waiting room chair, her breathing suddenly labored in a way that made Tank immediately alert. "Eleanor." Tank moved to her side, his combat medic training from Marine Service recognizing signs of potential cardiac event. "Are you okay?" "Just tired." Eleanor's voice came weaker than usual. "It's been a long day." But her color was wrong, her breathing too shallow, her expression showing pain she was trying to hide. Danny called for nurse immediately while Tank supported Eleanor's weight, preventing her from sliding out of the chair. The next minutes became blur. As medical staff responded to potential cardiac emergency, Eleanor being rushed to examination room, while Tank and Danny hovered anxiously outside. Cora watched with wide, frightened eyes, her young mind unable to process the possibility of losing the grandmother figure who had become so important to her life. Reaper and Iron Mike waited silently, both men recognizing that Eleanor Whitmore had become central to transformations they were beginning to embrace. If something happened to her, the fragile alliances and new approaches would likely collapse back into traditional antagonisms. Victor appeared in a wheelchair, pushed by nurse, refusing to remain isolated in his room while Eleanor's condition was uncertain. "She saved my nephew." His voice carried fierce loyalty. Gave him back to me. If she needs anything, anything at all, both chapters provided. The doctor emerged after 40 minutes that felt like days, his expression professionally neutral, but not grave. Mrs. Whitmore experienced a cardiac event, likely stress-induced given the circumstances. We're running tests to determine if there's underlying damage, but her condition is stable for now. Can we see her? Tank's voice carried barely controlled emotion, the possibility of losing Eleanor, forcing him to confront how dependent he'd become on her guidance. Family only. The doctor's automatic response was cut off by Eleanor's voice from inside the examination room. They are my family. Eleanor's tone carried weakened but unmistakable authority. Let them in. The room was too small for everyone, but they crowded in anyway. Tank and Danny flanking the bed, Cora climbing up to sit carefully beside Eleanor. Iron Mike and Reaper standing at the foot, Victor in his wheelchair near the door. An elderly widow surrounded by Hell's Angels and one traumatized child creating family portrait that defied every conventional definition. Eleanor looked at each of them, seeing fear in their faces that made her heart ache. I'm not dying today. Her voice carried gentle amusement at their worried expressions. But this is a reminder that none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. She reached for Cora's hand, her weathered fingers wrapping around the child's small ones. Sweetheart, what happened to you today was terrible. But look at how many people came together to bring you home. That's what love looks like. Cora nodded, her trauma-shocked face showing first traces of healing as she absorbed Eleanor's lesson. Daddy and his friends saved me. And the sheriff and the federal agents, and even Mr. Morrison from the Riverside chapter. Eleanor's eyes moved to Reaper, all of them working together because you mattered more than their differences. Tank knelt beside the bed, his massive frame somehow gentle as he looked at Eleanor. You scared us. His voice carried emotions he rarely allowed himself to express. We can't do this without you. You won't have to do it without me for a long time yet, Eleanor replied firmly. But eventually you will, which is why you need to internalize these lessons now. Brotherhood should unite, not divide. Strength protects rather than destroys. Cooperation creates better outcomes than isolation. She looked at Iron Mike and Reaper, seeing the beginning of genuine alliance between chapter presidents. You two proved today that working together makes you stronger. Don't forget that when you're back in familiar territory where old habits are comfortable. Both men nodded, their expressions showing they understood the significance of what had happened. The rescue operation had demonstrated that cooperation wasn't weakness but practical approach that achieved results traditional methods couldn't match. Danny pulled out his sketch pad, needing to capture this moment before it dissolved back into normal life. His hands moved quickly, rendering the scene with artistic skill that had evolved considerably in 6 months. Eleanor in hospital bed, surrounded by a protective circle of dangerous men who had been transformed by her influence. When he finished, he showed Eleanor the drawing. This is what family looks like. His voice carried wonder at the unlikely bonds that had formed. Blood and brotherhood and choice all mixed together. Eleanor studied the drawing, seeing herself through Danny's eyes, recognizing that her influence had extended further than she'd realized. Harold would have loved this. Her voice carried grief and joy together. He always believed that love was the strongest force in the universe, stronger than fear or hate or violence. Tank touched the wooden cross he still carried, Harold's craftsmanship connecting past to present. He was right. Love saved my daughter today. Love brought Danny and Victor together. Love is giving us purpose beyond just surviving. The doctor cleared his throat, reminding everyone that Eleanor needed rest despite the emotional significance of their gathering. Visiting hours are over. Mrs. Whitmore needs to sleep. They filed out reluctantly, each person stopping to touch Eleanor's hand or shoulder, physical contact communicating bonds that words couldn't capture. Victor was last, his wheelchair, bringing him close enough to speak privately. Thank you for giving me my nephew back. Victor's voice carried absolute sincerity, and for showing him that family can be more than just blood. Eleanor smiled at him. Help him develop his art. Make sure he gets the education he deserves. That's how you thank me. As they left, Eleanor settled into the hospital bed, exhaustion finally claiming her, now that the crisis had passed. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in darkening sky, constant and reliable, despite the chaos of human drama playing out beneath them. She thought about Harold, about the life they'd built together, about the love that had sustained them through 5 decades of marriage. She thought about Tank and Danny and Cora and Victor and all the unlikely connections that had formed because she chose compassion over fear on a frozen February morning. The universe had patterns, she decided, threads of meaning woven through seemingly random events. Finding Tank and Danny had been beginning of something larger than simple rescue transformation that rippled outward to touch lives and change relationships in ways she was only starting to understand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, questions about her health and mortality concerns, about whether the fragile alliances would survive when tested by normal life rather than crisis. But tonight, Eleanor Whitmore rested in the knowledge that she had helped create family from fragments built bridges across chasms that most people considered unbridgeable. And somewhere she was certain Harold was smiling. 3 months after Cora's rescue, Pine Valley had learned to live with transformation that seemed impossible just a year earlier. The autumn leaves painted the mountain landscape in gold and crimson, nature's own reminder that change was constant and beautiful and necessary for growth. Eleanor's recovery from her cardiac event had been slow but complete, though doctors' warnings about stress management and physical limitations now guided her activities with more restraint than her stubborn nature preferred. The hospital bed had been replaced by a rocking chair on her porch position from which she could oversee the unlikely empire of redemption that had grown from a simple act of compassion. Tank's Harley sat in the driveway beside Danny's bike, both machines now familiar enough that neighbors waved when they passed, rather than calling the sheriff. The two men had become permanent fixtures in Eleanor's life, their transformations progressing from fragile beginnings to sustainable changes that redefined who they were and who they aspired to become. The wooden cross Harold had carved occupied its place of honor on the porch railing, catching afternoon light and serving as silent witness to conversations that continued to reshape lives. Eleanor touched it sometimes while talking to Tank and Danny, feeling Harold's presence in the smooth wood his hands had shaped with such patient love. Cora's trauma from the kidnapping had begun to heal through combination of professional therapy and the security of knowing she was protected by an entire network of people who valued her safety above territorial disputes or pride. She visited Eleanor's cabin every weekend, now her innocent presence somehow essential to maintaining the humanity at the center of their unusual alliance. Victor had recovered sufficiently to leave the hospital, though injuries would plague him for months. He'd moved to Pine Valley temporarily, wanting proximity to Danny while building relationship that 20 years of separation had prevented. The two men navigated family dynamics with awkward sincerity, learning who each other were while grieving the time they'd lost. Iron Mike and Reaper had forged an alliance that shocked regional Hells Angels chapters, their cooperation representing fundamental challenge to traditional motorcycle club operations. Monthly meetings alternated between Pine Ridge and Riverside clubhouses, agendas focused on community engagement rather than territorial expansion or criminal enterprise. The transformation hadn't been universally celebrated. Several Hells Angels chapters viewed Pine Ridge and Riverside's cooperation model as betrayal of core identity weakness that would invite exploitation from rival clubs. Tensions were building, whispers about formal challenge to Iron Mike's leadership, rumors about potential violence designed to send message about limits of acceptable change. Eleanor knew confrontation was inevitable, that genuine transformation always faced resistance from people invested in status quo. She'd seen it in Korea when innovative medical techniques threatened established protocols, witnessed it in Pine Valley when her decision to help Tank and Danny challenged community assumptions about who deserved assistance. On a crisp October morning, Eleanor sat on her porch with Tank, Danny, and Victor discussing developments that suggested their experiment in redemption might face its most serious test yet. The Regional Hells Angels Council had called special meeting to address the Pine Ridge situation language that coded significant displeasure with Iron Mike's approach. They're going to demand he step down. Victor's voice carried bitter certainty born from decades of club politics. Too many old guard members see cooperation as existential threat to what Hells Angels represent. Tank nodded grimly, his expression showing he'd been expecting this development. Mike knew this was coming. He's prepared to defend his decisions, but the council can override chapter presidents if they demonstrate sufficient cause. What happens if they remove him? Eleanor asked, her practical mind already calculating consequences and contingencies. Depends on who replaces him. Danny replied, his artistic sensitivity making him acutely aware of emotional undercurrents in club dynamics. If they install someone who returns to traditional approaches, everything we've built collapses. Not everything. Eleanor's voice carried quiet conviction. The relationships we've formed, the lessons we've learned, the proof that cooperation produces better outcomes, none of that disappears because of leadership change. Victor studied Eleanor's face, seeing confidence that defied practical assessment of their situation. You really believe that? That transformation can survive institutional resistance? I believe that truth is more powerful than tradition, Eleanor replied simply. We've demonstrated that protecting children and building community makes us stronger than intimidating people and maintaining isolation. That truth doesn't stop being true because some council questions it. The conversation was interrupted by sound of multiple vehicles approaching, the rumble of motorcycle engines, accompanied by heavier vehicles that suggested official business rather than casual visit. Through the trees, Eleanor could see formation of bikes and trucks, distinctive Hells Angels patches visible on riders, creating escort for vehicle in the center. The procession emerged into Eleanor's driveway with choreographed precision. 20 motorcycles flanking black SUV that carried authority in its unmarked government appearance. The riders dismounted with synchronized efficiency, while SUV doors opened to reveal passengers whose presence suggested this was more than simple club business. Iron Mike led the motorcycle contingent, his expression grim but determined. Beside him, Reaper wore similar expression, both chapter presidents clearly prepared for confrontation that would determine their futures. But the SUV's occupants created surprise that made even these hardened men show visible reaction. A woman emerged first, her tailored suit and professional demeanor coding federal authority. She was followed by two men carrying briefcases and recording equipment, their movements suggesting documentation rather than tactical preparation. The final passenger was elderly man wearing Hells Angels patches from different era, his presence commanding respect that transcended current politics. Mrs. Whitmore. Iron Mike approached the porch with unusual formality. We've brought some people who wanted to meet you. This is Special Agent Catherine Morrison, FBI's Organized Crime Division. These are representatives from the Department of Justice, and this is Marcus Brennan Sr. Eleanor's heart stopped as she registered the final name, her eyes moving to the elderly man who bore unmistakable resemblance to Tank. This was the Marine from Harold's unit, the man who had saved her husband's life in Korea 70 years ago, the person Harold had searched for unsuccessfully for decades. Marcus Sr. moved toward the porch with slow deliberateness of someone whose body had been used hard during long life. At 92, he carried himself with dignity earned through surviving things that killed most people. His eyes, still sharp despite advanced age, studied Eleanor with recognition that seemed to transcend their lack of previous meeting. You're the woman who saved my grandson. His voice carried gravel and strength in equal measure. Tank sent me pictures. You look like the field nurses from Korea. Same expression in your eyes. Eleanor stood, despite her doctor's warnings about overexertion, moving down the porch steps to meet this living connection to Harold's past. Mr. Brennan, and your actions in Korea gave my husband and me 53 years of marriage. I've wanted to thank you for most of my adult life. Marcus Sr.'s weathered face showed emotion that decades of stoic masculinity tried to suppress. Which unit was your husband with? 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she connected present to past. Harold Whitmore. He was wounded during the Chinese counteroffensive in November 1952. He said Marines appeared out of nowhere and pulled his position out before they were overrun. The old Marine's eyes widened with recognition and grief. Harold Whitmore. I remember him. Young kid from Montana, kept talking about the girl back home he was going to marry. We got him to the field hospital with his guts held together by his own hands. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as Marcus described Harold, at 22, brave and terrified, and determined to survive for the life he hadn't lived yet. That girl back home was me, And because you saved him, we had 53 years together. We built this cabin. We created a life full of love and purpose. Marcus Sr. gripped Eleanor's hands with strength that belied his age. And now you've saved my grandson, completing a circle neither of us could have planned. Tank approached, slowly seeing his grandfather for first time in 5 years, the estrangement created by his self-destructive behavior and the family's inability to watch him destroy himself. Gramps. His voice came small and young. The tough biker dissolved by presence of man who had raised him after his parents died. Marcus, the old Marine's voice carried layers of meaning, disappointment, and love, and fierce pride warring in single word. Your letters told me about this woman, about how she's changing your life. I had to come see for myself. Eleanor stepped back, giving grandfather and grandson space for reunion that clearly involved complex history. She turned to Special Agent Morrison, whose presence suggested this visit was more than simple family gathering. Agent Morrison, I assume you're here about more than family reunions. Eleanor's practical nature asserted itself despite emotional weight of the moment. Catherine Morrison smiled with respect that suggested she'd been briefed about Eleanor's character. Mrs. Whitmore, we've been monitoring developments in Pine Valley and Riverside for several months. What you've accomplished represents potential model for addressing organized crime in ways traditional law enforcement hasn't succeeded. The admission that FBI was tracking their activities created visible tension among the Hells Angels members, decades of antagonism with federal authorities making cooperation feel like a dangerous trap. But Eleanor saw opportunity that transcended historical conflicts. You want to study what we're doing? Eleanor's voice carried understanding of bureaucratic imperatives that drove government agencies. Document our successes so they can be replicated elsewhere. More than that, Catherine replied, her tone becoming more serious. We want to offer institutional support, federal grants for community programs, training for law enforcement and cooperative approaches. Official recognition that undermines the council's narrative about your model representing weakness. Iron Mike and Reaper exchanged glances that showed they understood the significance of federal endorsement. If the government publicly supported their approach, resistance from traditional Hells Angels chapters would lose credibility. But accepting government partnership also risked being seen as betraying club independence. What's the catch? Reaper's voice carried suspicion earned through lifetime of government persecution. FBI doesn't suddenly start liking motorcycle clubs without wanting something in return. Complete transparency, Catherine replied honestly. Documentation of your activities, cooperation with oversight mechanisms, willingness to testify about what makes this model successful. Essentially, you become public examples of redemption and reintegration. So we give up privacy and autonomy in exchange for official approval. Tank's voice carried skepticism that matched Reaper's suspicion. Sounds like losing who we are to gain acceptance we don't want. Eleanor understood the resistance, recognized that maintaining identity while accepting institutional support required delicate balance. But she also saw opportunity to protect transformations they'd achieved from internal Hells Angels resistance that threatened to undo everything. Gentlemen, consider what you've accomplished. Eleanor's voice cut through skeptical murmuring. Cora is safe because you cooperated with law enforcement. Victor and Danny reunited because you shared information across chapter boundaries. Your communities respect you because you protect rather than threaten. Those achievements don't disappear because you accept help scaling them. Marcus Sr. nodded agreement, his perspective shaped by 90 years of witnessing social change. In Korea, we fought alongside people we had been taught to hate just years before. When survival requires cooperation, pride becomes luxury you can't afford. The old Marines' words carried weight that transcended current politics, connecting their situation to larger patterns of conflict resolution and necessary adaptation. The assembled Hells Angels members listened with respect earned through shared military heritage. What Eleanor's built here is what I tried to build in my chapter 40 years ago. Marcus Sr. continued, his voice carrying a regret about paths not taken. But I didn't have the courage to challenge tradition when it conflicted with common sense. I let the council dictate approach that kept us isolated and marginal instead of integrated and influential. He looked at Iron Mike and Reaper directly. You two have chance I wasted. Don't squander it because accepting help feels like weakness. The moment hung in balance as chapter presidents weighed tradition against transformation, club identity against practical outcomes, pride against survival. Eleanor watched their faces, seeing internal struggle play out in expressions that showed they understood the stakes. Victor broke the silence, his voice carrying authority earned through decades of club service. I vote we accept the FBI's proposal, not because I trust the government, but because I trust what we've built here is worth protecting from internal resistance. Danny nodded agreement, his recent reunion with Victor adding emotional weight to practical decision. The art program I'm developing needs funding and official recognition to expand beyond Pine Valley. Federal support makes that possible. Tank looked at Cora, who was watching the adults negotiate her future with 8-year-old seriousness. My daughter deserves to grow up in a world where her father's brotherhood builds communities instead of threatening them. If federal partnership helps make that world real, I support it. Iron Mike and Reaper exchanged long look that communicated decades of shared experience with government betrayal and institutional hostility. But they also saw opportunity to institutionalize changes they'd fought for, protecting their model from council's resistance. We'll need guarantees. Iron Mike's voice carried negotiators' caution. Protection for members who testify, assurance that cooperation doesn't become tool for prosecution of past activities. Recognition that we're partners in this model, not subjects being studied. Catherine Morrison nodded, her expression showing she'd anticipated these concerns. Everything you've mentioned is negotiable. The Department of Justice wants successful models for reintegration and crime reduction. Your transformation provides template if we can document what makes it work. Reaper studied Catherine's face, reading sincerity that his decades of assessing threats told him was genuine. Fine. Riverside chapter agrees to participate. But first sign of betrayal or exploitation, we're out and you deal with consequences. The agreement hung in air like treaty-ending conflict nobody had expected to resolve peacefully. Federal agents and Hell's Angels, chapter presidents, shaking hands represented cooperation that should have been impossible, transformation that rewrote rules about who could work together. Eleanor felt profound satisfaction watching these unlikely alliances form, seeing her simple act of compassion on February morning expand into institutional change that could affect thousands of lives. But she also felt exhaustion that reminded her of doctors' warnings about her heart condition and physical limitations. Marcus Sr. noticed Eleanor's fatigue as old Marine instincts, reading signs of distress she was trying to hide. Mrs. Whitmore, you should rest. We can handle the bureaucratic details. Eleanor nodded gratefully, accepting help from Tank and Danny as they guided her back to her rocking chair. From that position, she watched the negotiations continue. Federal agents and club members working through details that would define their partnership. The autumn sun was setting, painting the mountain landscape in shades of amber and crimson that made Eleanor think about endings and beginnings intertwined. Harold would have loved this moment, seeing redemption manifest in policy and practice, watching broken people rebuild themselves into something stronger. She touched the wooden cross, feeling Harold's presence in the grain and weight, connecting to love that transcended death through craftsmanship and memory. We did it, she whispered to the photograph in her pocket, the one of them on their wedding day. We taught them love is stronger than fear. 1 year later, the Harold and Eleanor Whitmore Community Center stood as permanent monument to transformation born from compassion. The building occupied 2 acres at the edge of Pine Valley, its construction funded by federal grants and private donations. Its operations staffed by volunteers from both traditional community members and Hell's Angels chapters across the region. Eleanor attended the grand opening ceremony in wheelchair, her heart condition having progressed to point where walking required more energy than her body could provide. But her mind remained sharp, her spirit undimmed by physical limitations, her influence growing even as her mobility declined. The ceremony drew a crowd of 300 people. Townspeople who had once feared Hell's Angels' presence. Chapter members who had traveled from 6 states to witness what cooperation could build, federal officials documenting successful model for reintegration, and media representatives telling story of redemption that transcended easy categorization. Tank stood at the podium, his massive frame somehow gentle as he addressed the assembly. His voice carried none of the aggressive posturing that had once defined his interaction with the world, replaced by quiet confidence that came from knowing his purpose and living it consistently. A year ago, I was drinking myself to death and sending money to a daughter I never saw. Eleanor Whitmore gave me reason to be better than my worst moments. She showed me that strength protects rather than destroys. That brotherhood can build communities instead of threatening them. He paused, his eyes finding Eleanor in the front row. She saved my life twice. Once by pulling me from a frozen ditch. Again by teaching me that redemption is possible if you're willing to do the work. Danny spoke next, his artist's eloquence giving voice to transformation that had taken him from foster care to certified educator. The art program we're launching today will serve 12 schools across 3 counties. It's funded by federal grants, supported by local businesses, and staffed by volunteers who believe creativity can heal trauma and build hope. He held up a sketch pad showing drawing of Eleanor, surrounded by the unlikely family she'd created. This is what love looks like. Blood and choice and brotherhood all mixed together. Mrs. Whitmore taught us that every person deserves dignity, regardless of their past or their affiliations. Victor followed his recovery from accident, nearly complete, though he still moved with careful deliberation. The foster care support program we're establishing provides mentorship, resources, and advocacy for kids aging out of the system. Danny and I both know that trauma, and we're committed to ensuring no child feels as abandoned as we did. Iron Mike and Reaper spoke jointly, their alliance now formalized through regional council approval that had been hard-won but ultimately successful. Their testimony about increased community safety, reduced recidivism among club members, and improved relationships with law enforcement had swayed enough council members to make cooperation official policy. The Pine Ridge and Riverside model is now operating in 15 chapters across 8 states. Iron Mike's voice carried pride earned through resistance and validation. We're not just motorcycle clubs anymore. We're community protectors, youth mentors, disaster responders. We're proving that people can change if given proper support and accountability. The ribbon-cutting ceremony featured unexpected guests, Marcus Brennan Sr., 93 now, and frail but determined to witness the legacy his grandson was building. He stood beside Eleanor's wheelchair, 2 veterans from different wars watching transformation they had helped create. Harold would be proud, Marcus said quietly to Eleanor, his voice carrying emotion that 90 years of stoic masculinity couldn't fully suppress. You took the life I gave him and used it to change the world. Eleanor smiled through tears that came easily now that age and illness had stripped away pretense. He is proud. I feel him here in this building, in these people, in the love that's multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined. The community center's programs launched immediately. After-school art classes led by Danny Job Training, coordinated by Tank Counseling Services, staffed by licensed professionals meeting space for community organizations. The Hells Angels chapters committed to maintaining security and facilities management, their presence transforming from threat to protective resource. Cora cut the ribbon officially, her 10-year-old hands holding oversized scissors, while photographers captured the symbolic moment. She had become unofficial mascot for the transformation. Her recovery from kidnapping trauma, serving as proof that healing was possible with proper support and protection. The celebration continued into evening conversations, mixing townspeople and bikers with easy familiarity that would have been impossible just 18 months earlier. Eleanor held court from her wheelchair, accepting gratitude and sharing wisdom with people whose lives had been touched by her influence. Sheriff Oakes approached with unusual formality, his expression showing emotion he rarely displayed. Mrs. Whitmore, crime rates in our region are down 47% since you started this experiment. Property crime down 62%. Emergency response times improved by 30%. Those aren't just statistics. Those are lives saved and communities protected. Eleanor accepted the acknowledgement without triumphalism. Wade, I just created space for people to be their best selves. They did the actual work of transformation. As night fell and the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor's energy finally failed completely. Tank and Danny wheeled her back to the specially equipped van that had become necessary for her transportation, their faces showing concern about her increasing frailty. "I'm fine." Eleanor's voice came weak, but carrying familiar stubbornness. "Just tired. It's been a long day." But both men recognized signs that Doctor had warned them about, indicators that Eleanor's time was running shorter than any of them wanted to acknowledge. They drove her home in careful silence, each lost in thoughts about what life would be like when her presence was only memory. The following weeks brought increasing clarity that Eleanor's health was failing irreversibly. Her heart condition had progressed beyond medical intervention, leaving only palliative care and the question of how much time remained. Doctors' estimates ranged from months to possibly a year, uncertainty adding its own weight to inevitable loss. Eleanor faced her mortality with same practical courage she'd brought to every challenge, more concerned about ensuring her legacy survived than prolonging her own life. She spent hours with Tank and Danny, recording stories about Harold, sharing lessons learned through 8 decades of living, offering wisdom about maintaining transformation when her stabilizing influence was gone. The wooden cross Harold had carved became focal point for these conversations, its presence connecting past to future through craftsmanship that would outlast them all. Eleanor held it often now, feeling Harold's love in the smooth wood and patient carving. Victor visited daily, bringing Danny for conversations that ranged from practical planning to philosophical reflection. The uncle and nephew had built relationship that honored Sarah's memory, while creating new bonds based on mutual respect and shared commitment to helping foster children. "When I'm gone," Eleanor told them during one of these visits, "the center will need strong leadership to maintain its mission against inevitable resistance. People will try to return to familiar antagonisms. Your job is to keep showing them that cooperation produces better outcomes." Danny nodded, his artistic sensitivity making him acutely aware of the weight Eleanor was preparing them to carry. "We'll honor everything you've taught us. Your legacy will live in the programs we build and the people we help." Eleanor smiled at his earnest promise, seeing in his face the frightened foster kid who had been dying in a snowbank 18 months ago. "You've already honored it by becoming someone who creates beauty and nurtures potential. That's the greatest legacy anyone can leave." Tank struggled more openly with Eleanor's impending death, his gruff exterior cracking to reveal the emotional vulnerability he'd spent decades suppressing. "You saved my life," his voice broke completely. "Gave me back my daughter, taught me that redemption is possible. I don't know how to do this without you." Eleanor reached for his massive hand, her own fingers frail but firm. "Marcus, you've been doing it without me for months now. You're a good father to Cora, a loyal friend to Danny, a leader who builds communities instead of threatening them. I didn't create those qualities. I just helped you remember they were always there." The conversation was interrupted by commotion outside, multiple vehicles arriving with urgency that suggested crisis rather than scheduled visit. Through the window, Eleanor could see emergency vehicles, news trucks, and the organized chaos that accompanied major disaster. Sheriff Oakes rushed onto the porch, his face showing stress and exhaustion. "Mrs. Whitmore, we've got a situation. Major accident on Interstate 90. Bridge collapse. Multiple vehicles involved, casualties estimated over 100. We need every trained person available for search and rescue." Eleanor felt familiar adrenaline surge, muscle memory from Korea, responding to mass casualty situations despite her body's limitations. "How can I help?" Wade's expression showed he'd expected this response despite her obvious frailty. "We've set up triage center at the community center. We need someone to coordinate medical response and manage volunteer deployment. Someone everyone trusts to make life or death decisions." Within an hour, the community center had transformed into forward operating base for disaster response. Eleanor directed operations from wheelchair position at the central coordination table, her military hospital experience providing framework for managing chaos and prioritizing interventions. Tank and Danny mobilized every trained Hells Angels member across 6 chapters, creating search and rescue teams that deployed into the disaster site with practiced efficiency. Their mechanical skills proved invaluable for extracting victims from crushed vehicles, their comfort with danger, allowing them to work in conditions that paralyzed less experienced volunteers. Victor coordinated logistics, his decades of organizational experience, ensuring supplies reached where they were needed, and communications remained clear, despite overwhelming demands. His reunion with Danny had given him renewed purpose, and now he channeled that energy into disaster response that saved lives. Federal agents who had been on monitoring the cooperation model found themselves working alongside club members. They'd spent careers investigating jurisdictional boundaries dissolving in face of genuine emergency. Catherine Morrison worked directly with Reaper, their unlikely partnership proving more effective than traditional hierarchies. Cora helped in the children's area, her own trauma giving her unexpected ability to comfort young victims who needed gentle care while parents were located. At 10 years old, she embodied the transformation Eleanor had set in motion, showing that healing creates capacity for helping others heal. The disaster response continued for 72 hours of relentless effort, testing everyone's limits, improving the value of cooperation in ways theoretical discussions never could. By the time final victims were extracted and casualty counts finalized, the death toll had been minimized through coordinated response that maximized resources and minimized bureaucratic delays. Eleanor had remained at her post throughout, ignoring doctors' warnings and her body's protest to provide leadership when it mattered most. But when the crisis finally passed and adrenaline faded, her collapse was immediate and terrifying. Tank caught her as she slumped in her wheelchair, her breathing suddenly labored and her color ashen. Medical personnel responded immediately, but their faces showed what everyone feared. Eleanor's heart had finally exceeded its capacity for extraordinary demands. The ambulance ride to the hospital was familiar territory now, though this time carried finality that previous scares had lacked. Tank and Danny rode in the vehicle with her, holding her hands while paramedics worked to stabilize cardiac function that was failing despite their efforts. "Tell Cora I love her." Eleanor's voice came barely audible over medical equipment. "Tell her that love is stronger than fear. Tell her that one person's kindness can change the world if they're brave enough to try." Tank wept openly, his tears falling on Eleanor's hand, while he struggled to accept that the woman who had saved his life was dying. "You can tell her yourself, you're going to be fine." But Eleanor's smile suggested she knew better, that she'd felt this kind of deterioration before and recognized when bodies reach their limits. "I've lived a good life, Marcus. 53 years with Harold, decades serving this community. The privilege of watching you and Danny transform into men your grandfather would be proud of." Danny gripped her other hand with desperate strength, unable to voice the grief threatening to overwhelm him. His artistic sensitivity made him acutely aware of Eleanor's life force fading despite medical intervention. The hospital's emergency team was waiting when they arrived, their rapid response suggesting Wade had called ahead with warnings about Eleanor's condition. But despite aggressive treatment and specialized intervention, Eleanor's heart continued to fail, its muscle tissue too damaged to sustain function much longer. Iron Mike and Reaper arrived within hours, their presence representing dozens of chapter members who had driven through the night to be there. Marcus Sr. came despite his own frailty, the 93-year-old Marine determined to say goodbye to the woman who had saved his grandson and completed the circle Harold had started 70 years ago. Victor brought flowers from Danny's art students, their handmade cards expressing gratitude to the teacher who had encouraged their creativity. Sheriff Oakes came with reports about disaster response success, wanting Eleanor to know that her leadership had saved an estimated 30 lives through improved coordination and resource deployment. Mrs. Patterson appeared with photograph of her late husband, Thomas, the man Tank had killed in drunk driving accident 10 years ago. She sat beside Eleanor's bed with quiet dignity, her presence representing forgiveness that had seemed impossible, but had been achieved through Eleanor's gentle insistence on seeing humanity in everyone. Lydia brought Cora, who climbed carefully onto the hospital bed to curl beside Eleanor, despite nurses' protests. The 10-year-old's presence seemed to comfort Eleanor more than medical intervention, her small hand wrapped in Eleanor's frail fingers. "Grandma Eleanor, you can't die." Cora's voice carried childhood certainty that love could overcome mortality. "We need you." Eleanor stroked Cora's hair with trembling fingers, her voice weak but carrying absolute conviction. "Sweetheart, I'm not leaving you. I'll live in every person I've touched, in every program we built, in every life that's been changed by choosing love over fear." She looked around the room at the assembled crowd, seeing the family she'd created through simple acts of compassion. You are my legacy, not buildings or programs, but transformed lives that will transform others. That's how love multiplies across time. The doctor approached Tank and Danny quietly, his expression showing what words would confirm. Her heart is failing. We can make her comfortable, but there's nothing more we can do medically. Tank nodded, understanding that Eleanor deserved peaceful death rather than desperate attempts to extend suffering. Let her go with dignity. That's what she'd want. The family gathered closer, creating protective circle around Eleanor's bed, while her breathing became increasingly labored. Marcus Sr. held one hand, Tank and Danny the other, Victor and Cora positioned where she could see them. The unlikely family constellation that should have been impossible. Eleanor's eyes moved from face to face, seeing in each person proof that transformation was possible, that love could bridge any divide, that one person's courageous choice could ripple outward to change communities and save lives. Harold, she whispered to presence only she could sense. I'm coming home. We did good work here. We showed them love is stronger than fear. Her breathing slowed, becoming peaceful rather than labored. Her face relaxing into expression of completion rather than pain. The monitor showed her heart rate declining steadily, her body finally surrendering to limits it had exceeded for Eleanor's entire life. At 3:17 in the morning on November 14th, Eleanor Whitmore stopped breathing. The woman who had saved 2 frozen Hell's Angels and transformed entire communities through acts of compassion died surrounded by the family she'd created. Her legacy secure in the lives she'd touched, in the love she'd multiplied. The funeral 3 days later drew over 1,000 people. Townspeople whose prejudices Eleanor had challenged, Hell's Angels members, whose lives she'd transformed, federal officials, whose policies she'd influenced, and children whose futures she'd brightened through programs and possibility. Tank delivered eulogy that left few dry eyes, his voice breaking repeatedly as he described the woman who had seen humanity in dangerous men when everyone else saw only threat. Danny created memorial artwork that captured Eleanor's essence: strength and gentleness, wisdom and humility, courage and compassion, all reflected in her weathered face. Cora sang at the service, her young voice carrying hymn about grace and redemption that Eleanor had loved. Marcus Sr. presented the wooden cross Harold had carved, placing it on the casket as symbol of faith that had sustained Eleanor through 8 decades of choosing love over fear. The burial took place beside Harold's grave, reuniting husband and wife after 2 years of separation. The mountain landscape that Eleanor had loved spread below the cemetery, Pine Valley, peaceful and protected in the autumn sunshine. As mourners dispersed, Tank and Danny remained at the graveside, neither man ready to walk away from the woman who had saved their lives in every sense that mattered. She changed everything. Danny's voice carried wonder mixed with grief. One person, one choice to help instead of walk away. And look what it created. Tank nodded, touching the wooden cross one final time before they would leave it to mark Eleanor's final resting place. She proved that love is stronger than fear, that redemption is possible, that one act of kindness can change the world. 5 years later, the Harold and Eleanor Whitmore Community Center operated at full capacity, its programs expanded across 12 counties and serving thousands of people annually. The cooperation model had spread to 38 Hells Angels chapters, fundamentally reshaping how motorcycle clubs interacted with communities and law enforcement. Tank directed the Security and Disaster Response Division, training other chapters in community protection approaches that built trust rather than fear. His relationship with Cora had flourished, their bond strengthened by shared grief over Eleanor's death and mutual commitment to honoring her legacy. Danny chaired the Arts Education Department, his programs now operating in 43 schools across 5 states. His artwork hung in galleries and community centers, each piece dedicated to Eleanor's memory and the transformation she had made possible. Victor had established foster care advocacy network that served 800 children annually providing mentorship, resources, and support that prevented the kind of abandonment he and Danny had experienced. His reunion with Danny had given him purpose that extended far beyond his own healing. Cora, now 15, volunteered at the community center while maintaining straight A grades and preparing for college applications. She had announced her intention to become trauma surgeon, following Eleanor's path of using medical skills to serve people others had given up on. The wooden cross Harold had carved occupied place of honor in the community center's memorial gallery, surrounded by photographs documenting transformation from first rescue to current operations. Visitors touched it reverently, feeling connection to Eleanor's legacy through Harold's craftsmanship. On the 5th anniversary of Eleanor's death, a dedication ceremony unveiled permanent memorial sculpture in Pine Valley Town Square. The bronze statue depicted Eleanor surrounded by children and motorcycles, her walking stick raised not in defense but in welcome. Tank stood before the assembled crowd, now including state officials and national media representatives. 5 years ago, we buried a woman who changed the world through simple acts of compassion. Today, we honor her by continuing the work she started. He gestured toward the sculpture, its bronze surface catching afternoon light. Eleanor Whitmore taught us that love is stronger than fear, that redemption is possible, that one person's courageous choice can ripple outward to change communities and save lives. This memorial doesn't capture her fully. Nothing could. But it reminds us that transformation is always possible if we're brave enough to try. As the ceremony concluded, an accident occurred on the road beside the town square. A teenager on a motorcycle hit gravel, the bike going down hard and throwing the rider onto asphalt. Before emergency services could be called, 20 people rushed to help. Townspeople and Hells Angels members working together instinctively. Tank reached the victim first, his combat medic training, directing immediate assessment and intervention. Danny called 911 while coordinating crowd control. Victor retrieved the medical kit every Hells Angels member now carried. Cora spoke calmly to the frightened teenager, using techniques Eleanor had taught her for managing trauma and fear. The response was immediate, coordinated, effective. The teenager's injuries were minor, but the help was comprehensive and compassionate. Exactly what Eleanor would have done. As the ambulance departed and the crowd dispersed, Tank and Danny stood before Eleanor's memorial, seeing in bronze what lived in their hearts. The sculpture showed Eleanor's face as they remembered it, wise and kind, strong and gentle, challenging and accepting all at once. She's still teaching us, Danny said quietly, his artist's eye appreciating the sculpture's craftsmanship, while his heart responded to what it represented. 5 years gone and still showing us how to be better than we thought we could be. Tank nodded, touching the bronze walking stick the way he touched the wooden cross Harold had carved. Every time someone chooses compassion over fear, Eleanor's legacy continues. Every time we build instead of destroy, she's still with us. Cora joined him, in her 15-year-old face showing maturity beyond her years. Grandma Eleanor used to say that love multiplies across time. I finally understand what she meant. We're multiplying it, all of us, every day. The autumn sun set over Pine Valley, painting the mountain landscape in shades of gold and amber that made Eleanor's memorial glow with internal light. The town that had once feared Hell's Angels now worked alongside them. The communities that had been isolated now cooperated. The lives that had seemed beyond redemption now served and protected and built. All because one elderly widow chose to see humanity in two frozen men beside a wrecked motorcycle. All because love proved stronger than fear. All because Eleanor Whitmore believed that one person's kindness could change the world if they were brave enough to try. And 5 years after her death, and the lives transformed, and the communities protected, and the legacy multiplied across time, she had been proven absolutely right.